The room smells faintly of polish and something medicinal. Gaslight settles against gilded frames. The carpets are thick enough to mute footsteps, thick enough to suggest permanence. In the Gilded Age, wealth did not announce itself, it assumed itself. To be born into money was to believe, instinctively, that comfort was a law of nature, as reliable as gravity, as unquestioned as inheritance. And yet money, like ether, evaporates when handled carelessly. This was an age that raised heirs without preparing them for limits. Sons learned pleasure before prudence. Daughters were shielded from consequence and handed expense accounts instead. Trust funds arrived early. Warnings arrived late, and when fortunes began to thin, society responded not with alarm, but with silence. Silence upholstered in velvet, silence disguised as dignity. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in. If you're drawn to stories like this, quiet collapses, hidden failures, history whispered rather than shouted, tap like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Cities, bedrooms, night shifts, long drives, it all matters here. Because this is not a story of sudden disaster. It is a story of slow ruin, of railroads converted into champagne, of estates sold one discrete parcel at a time, of heirs who mistook inheritance for immunity and refinement for restraint. No scandal headlines, no public disgrace, just ledgers quietly closing, rooms growing emptier, and families insisting until the very end that everything was still perfectly fine. Born rich, died broke, and in between, an entire age that refused to believe it was possible. The child does not remember cold. He is carried through corridors that never draft, through rooms already heated by coal fires banked long before dawn. The windows are tall, the glass thick, the curtains heavy enough to mute the street beyond. Outside, winter exists as an abstraction, something glimpsed from behind lace, softened by distance and wealth. Inside, everything is arranged in advance. Comfort precedes consciousness. This is how inheritance begins, not as money, but as environment. From the first breath, the world behaves as though it has been prepared. Meals arrive without request. Clothing appears without urgency. Shoes are polished by hands that do not belong to the wearer. The child learns early that needs are met before they are spoken, and often before they are even felt. This is not indulgence yet, it is instruction. A quiet lesson that the world responds automatically, that effort is optional, that stability is the natural state of things. In the Gilded Age, fortunes did not announce themselves loudly inside the home. There was no counting of coins at the table, no discussion of cost. Money functioned like oxygen, essential, invisible, assumed. Fathers left in the morning to oversee railroads, mills, banks, and enterprises that spanned cities. Mothers managed social calendars, not budgets. Children were raised inside the result, not the process. What they inherited first was certainty. Nurses soothed without hesitation. Tutors corrected gently, never harshly. Mistakes were absorbed by the household, the way spills were absorbed by carpets designed to conceal them. Failure, when it occurred, was framed as eccentricity. Consequence was something that belonged to other families, families with smaller dining rooms and fewer servants. The house itself taught this lesson relentlessly. Walls were thick enough to keep out noise, and by extension, reality. Bells summoned help instantly. The rhythm of the day was maintained by others, cooks, maids, valets, whose labor ensured that time passed smoothly, without friction. The heir did not learn how systems worked. He learned that systems worked for him. The difference was subtle, but it would prove decisive. There was talk, sometimes, of legacy. Portraits lined the staircases, stern men with folded hands, women posed beside symbols of refinement. names repeated across generations like a refrain. But these were not lessons in stewardship. They were assurances, proof that wealth persisted, evidence that the family endured. No one explained how fragile this endurance actually was. At school, the heir encountered peers much like himself, boys and girls raised inside similar houses, taught similar manners, insulated by similar assumptions. Competition existed, but it was decorative. Grades mattered less than posture. Ambition was admired only when it remained tasteful. Urgency was considered unbecoming. One did not scramble when one belonged. And so, restraint was never rehearsed. Allowances arrived early, framed as character building rather than dangerous. Spending was encouraged as cultivation traveled to broaden the mind, clothing to refine the image, leisure to signal status. The language was careful, medical even. Money was administered in controlled doses, like a tonic meant to strengthen rather than weaken. No one considered that the patient might grow dependent. What the heir did not inherit was fear. There was no memory of scarcity to temper desire, no recollection of risk to sharpen judgment. The world had always yielded. It had always adjusted. Bills had always been settled somewhere else, by someone else, behind doors that never opened onto the nursery. And so the rooms remained warm. Not because the heir maintained them, but because they had always been warm. The fires burned whether he noticed them or not. The house persisted without his involvement, reinforcing a quiet, corrosive belief that continuity required no participation. This was not yet excess, not yet failure. It was simply the beginning, an upbringing so carefully cushioned that it mistook preparation for protection and comfort for permanence. The fortune was intact, but the foundation, unseen and untested, had already begun to thin. The money arrives without ceremony. It is not handed over in a manner that suggests importance. There is no lecture, no warning, no gravity attached to the sum. It appears as part of the household's rhythm, as predictable as meals or seasonal wardrobes. A figure is named weekly, monthly, quarterly, and it is spoken softly, as though volume might disturb something delicate. The child learns the number not as value, but as entitlement. This is the first allowance, and it is offered not as a test, but as reassurance. In many households of the Gilded Age, the allowance is framed as an educational tool, a polite fiction meant to suggest responsibility, yet it is carefully engineered to remove risk. The sum is generous enough to prevent scarcity, yet small enough, at least in theory, to imply restraint. What no one acknowledges is that the allowance exists within a much larger safety net, one so wide and forgiving that any mistake can be absorbed without consequence. The child spends without fear because fear has never been introduced. Purchases are made experimentally at first. A book left unread, a toy admired briefly and then forgotten, clothing chosen for novelty rather than necessity. Each transaction reinforces the same lesson. Money moves outward, never inward. There is no replenishment through effort, no recovery through discipline. Funds simply arrive again, on schedule, regardless of what was done with the last portion. The allowance teaches rhythm, not judgment. Adults watch these early expenditures with indulgent amusement. Waste is reframed as learning. Excess is described as youthful enthusiasm. There is pride, even in a child who spends freely. It suggests confidence, taste, belonging. No one interrupts to ask whether the money achieved anything lasting. The purpose of the allowance is not growth, but normalization. And so spending becomes familiar. Shops learn the heir's name quickly. Clerks smile, attentive but unchallenging. Credit is extended early, quietly, as a courtesy rather than a contract. The child learns that politeness substitutes for payment, that reputation softens obligation. Receipts are tucked away, examined by no one. The mechanism of accounting remains invisible, deliberately so. What is being withheld is not money, but instruction. No one explains how long the allowance could continue. No one ties it to performance, to stewardship, or to the larger machinery of the family fortune. The allowance is detached from context, floating free of railways, factories, investments, and labor. It exists as a personal resource rather than a shared responsibility. This separation is crucial. By isolating the heir from the origin of wealth, the allowance creates a false intimacy. Money feels personal, responsive, almost affectionate. It arrives reliably, asks nothing in return, and corrects no behavior. The heir learns to associate spending with autonomy rather than obligation, with pleasure rather than planning. Even generosity, when encouraged, is carefully curated. Donations are suggested, but never required. Charity is framed as expression, not sacrifice. One gives because it feels appropriate, not because it costs something meaningful. The allowance remains untouched by loss. Even when shared, there is always more coming. This is how consequence is delayed indefinitely. As adolescence approaches, the allowance grows. Its increase is justified as maturity, though maturity itself is never tested. Larger sums move through the heir's hands without altering habits formed earlier. The scale changes, but the pattern remains. Money flows outward. Accountability remains elsewhere. By the time the allowance is substantial enough to cause real damage, the heir no longer recognizes spending as a decision. It has become a reflex. The first allowance was never meant to ruin anyone. It was meant to prepare. But preparation without limits is not preparation at all. It is sedation, an early dose of comfort administered so gently that its effects go unnoticed. The heir does not feel reckless, he feels normal. He feels entitled to ease, to correction without pain, to continuity without effort. And somewhere beyond the warm rooms and polite transactions, the true cost begins to accrue. Unseen, unremarked, waiting, the trust is introduced as reassurance. It is not explained in full, never in full. Its existence is mentioned in passing, folded into conversation the way one references a family doctor or a distant relative. It is spoken of with confidence, with finality. You are provided for. The phrase settles gently, designed to calm rather than instruct. Whatever uncertainties exist in the world beyond the house, they will not be permitted to cross its threshold. In Gilded Age families, the trust is not framed as wealth. It is framed as protection. Documents are signed in rooms the heir rarely enters. Lawyers speak in measured tones. Fathers nod. Mothers listen politely. The language is dense, technical, intentionally inaccessible. This is not secrecy born of malice, but of certainty, the belief that some things are too important to trouble children with, that insulation is an act of care. And so the trust becomes abstract. To the heir, it is not an account, not an instrument, not a responsibility. It is a condition, like health, like lineage, like the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. The trust exists to ensure continuity, not to demand participation. Its purpose is to remove anxiety, not to create awareness. The comparison often made is medical. The trust is described as something that will support the heir, sustain him, step in if needed. Its language mirrors that of tonics and treatments popular in the age-measured doses, controlled access, professional oversight. One does not ask a patient to understand the chemistry of ether or morphine. One simply administers it to restore calm. Likewise, the trust is meant to preserve equilibrium, not provoke curiosity. But medicine dulls as much as it heals. The heir grows knowing that somewhere beyond his reach, something stands ready to correct excess. Mistakes will not be terminal. Losses will not be final. If spending outpaces allowance, the trust absorbs the imbalance. If debts accumulate quietly, the trust waits patiently. It is not indulgence, yet it is insurance. And insurance changes behavior. Risk feels distant. Consequence feels theoretical. The trust is not touched often at first, but its presence alters every decision indirectly. The heir does not think, "Can I afford this?" He thinks, "This will be managed." Responsibility migrates outward, into unseen mechanisms operated by unseen hands. There are rules, of course. Trusts always have rules, ages, conditions, restrictions. But these are presented as milestones, not barriers. When access is delayed, it is not denied, it is promised. Patience is encouraged, but urgency is never required. The trust teaches waiting, not restraint. Anticipation replaces planning. In some families, the trust is discussed openly, almost proudly. In others, it is treated with quiet reverence, mentioned only when reassurance is needed. But in neither case is it framed as fragile. No one speaks of markets turning, industries collapsing, fortunes thinning. The trust is treated as immutable, as permanent as the family name engraved above the door. This belief proves contagious. Servants behave as though the household will always function. Advisors speak as though the future is already secured. Even warnings, when offered, are softened. Language bends to avoid discomfort. The trust, like medicine, is never blamed for dependency. As the heir matures, he begins to rely on the trust without consciously acknowledging it. It sits beneath every decision like a safety net he has never seen deployed, but fully expects to catch him. He is not reckless in his own mind. He is merely unafraid. This is the quiet danger. Trusts were designed to preserve wealth across generations, but in shielding heirs from exposure to risk, to consequence, to scarcity, they often preserved something else instead: ignorance. Not ignorance of facts, but ignorance of fragility. By the time the trust is finally drawn upon in earnest, the heir does not experience it as loss or failure. He experiences it as function, as proof that the system works. And like a patient comforted by a familiar dose, he does not notice that the medicine is slowly losing its effect. The trust still exists, but the dependence it has fostered now moves faster than the fortune itself. The house is full of people, yet no one confronts the heir. Servants move constantly through the rooms, quiet, efficient, trained to anticipate rather than intervene. Shoes are polished before they are noticed as dull. Spills disappear before they can become stains. Doors open at the right moment, close just as gently. The household functions as a system designed to remove friction, and in doing so, it removes instruction. Correction, when it exists at all, is indirect. In Gilded Age homes, servants were not merely labor, they were buffers. They absorbed excess, concealed error, and smoothed over habits that might otherwise provoke discomfort. If a child left lights burning, someone extinguished them. If meals were wasted, someone cleared them away without comment. If objects were broken, replacements appeared quietly. The heir learned, not consciously but thoroughly, that the world adjusted itself around him. Discipline was not absent. It was misplaced. Servants were disciplined relentlessly, taught to be invisible, restrained, exact. The heir observed this discipline without ever experiencing its weight. Authority flowed downward in the household, never inward. Orders were given and obeyed, but never questioned. In this arrangement, the heir did not learn responsibility. He learned command without consequence. Silence became a form of approval. When behavior went unchecked, it felt affirmed. The absence of resistance suggested correctness. Even indulgence appeared respectable when carried out within such polished surroundings. Excess was not disruptive. It was absorbed seamlessly into the rhythm of the house. The heir was never forced to confront the limits of his actions, because the household existed to protect him from those limits. This dynamic extended beyond childhood. As the heir grew older, servants continued to manage the fallout of decisions made casually. Late nights were followed by quiet mornings. Messes were addressed discreetly. Debts, when small enough, were settled through channels the heir never saw. No one spoke sharply. No one warned him that patterns were forming. It was not the servant's place. In many cases, servants understood far more than they revealed. They saw waste accumulate. They noticed habits hardening. They recognized the difference between wealth that renews itself and wealth that is merely spent. But their role was preservation of comfort, not confrontation. Speaking out risked dismissal. Silence ensured survival. And so the silence endured. The heir came to believe that harmony was the natural outcome of his choices, that his presence did not disturb order, but maintained it. Even when mistakes were obvious, they were corrected so quickly and discreetly that they never registered as mistakes at all. The house reinforced this illusion daily. Clocks were wound. Fires were tended. Food appeared precisely when expected. Nothing broke permanently. Nothing failed outright. The machinery of comfort hid its own labor so completely that the heir mistook the result for inevitability. In such an environment, accountability had nowhere to take root. By the time the heir left the house, if he left at all, he carried this expectation with him. Hotels felt familiar. Restaurants operated as extensions of the household. Shops behaved like well-trained rooms. Staff elsewhere seemed merely temporary versions of the servants he had always known. The world, he assumed, worked the same way. What he did not see was the cost of this arrangement. Not in wages, not in hours, but in education withheld. The servants who corrected nothing were not negligent. They were fulfilling their purpose. But in doing so, they helped create a person unaccustomed to friction, to resistance, to the instructive discomfort of consequence. Later, when money began to thin, when systems no longer absorbed excess so effortlessly, the heir would find the silence disorienting. For the first time, things would remain broken. But in these early years, the house remains intact, the servants remain attentive. The heir moves through his days unchallenged. Convinced by 1,000 quiet corrections, he never witnesses that his way of living requires no adjustment at all. The lesson is learned perfectly, and it will prove ruinous. School arrives gently, like everything else. There is no rupture between home and classroom, no sharp transition from comfort to discipline. Education, for the heir, is not an ascent or a struggle. It is a continuation. The same polish carries over stone buildings warmed by coal fires, instructors chosen as much for manners as for intellect, schedules designed to refine rather than to press. Learning is treated as cultivation, not preparation. From the beginning, the pace is forgiving. Deadlines exist, but they are elastic. Failure is rare, and when it occurs, it is explained away as temperament rather than deficiency. A poor mark suggests distraction, not danger. A missed lesson is corrected quietly. The system bends because it is built to bend for those who belong. There is no sense of the clock. In Gilded Age schools for the wealthy, time does not threaten. Examinations do not determine survival. Performance does not dictate opportunity. The future is already secured elsewhere, and everyone in the room knows it. Education becomes ornamental, a finishing process rather than a forge. One is shaped, not tested. Subjects are selected for polish. Languages are encouraged for elegance. History is presented as inheritance rather than warning. Mathematics is taught abstractly, safely removed from consequence. Economics, when discussed at all, is theoretical, far from ledgers, wages, and collapse. Practicality is considered inelegant, urgency vulgar. The heir absorbs knowledge without friction. There is no pressure to master, only to appreciate. Curiosity is praised, but only when it remains tasteful. Ambition is allowed, but discouraged if it appears hungry. The worst sin is not ignorance, but eagerness. To want too much, too visibly, suggests insecurity, an attribute associated with those outside the gates. Teachers understand this instinctively. They do not push, they guide, they correct softly. They recognize that their role is not to prepare students for struggle, but to prepare them for presence. The heir is being trained to occupy rooms, to converse smoothly, to signal belonging. Success is measured in composure, not competence. This absence of urgency is subtle, but decisive. Without pressure, effort loses meaning. Without stakes, discipline never forms. The heir learns that knowledge is optional because consequences are distant. There is no moment when failure threatens to close a door, no instance where ignorance proves costly. Every path remains open, regardless of preparation, and so choices become weightless. When graduation arrives, it feels inevitable rather than earned. Certificates are awarded with polite applause. Families gather, confident, satisfied. The heir steps forward not with clarity but with assumption. He has been educated but never strained, prepared in appearance but not in resilience. The world beyond school seems equally forgiving at first. Travel replaces study. Leisure fills the gap where vocation might have formed. The heir drifts easily from classroom to drawing room, from lectures to lounges, carrying credentials that impress without anchoring. He knows about things, but not through them. He has never been made uncomfortable long enough to understand his limits. This is the quiet cost of education without urgency. No one ever demanded that the heir choose quickly, fail decisively, or commit fully. Time stretched endlessly, padded by wealth and reassurance. The future was assumed to be long, generous, and correctable. Mistakes could be made later, discipline could arrive later, purpose could wait. But waiting teaches its own lesson. By removing the need to act, education teaches passivity. By cushioning failure, it teaches indifference. The heir emerges polished, articulate, and profoundly untested, equipped to discuss the world, but not to withstand it. The schooling is complete. The illusion remains intact. And somewhere beyond the ivy-covered walls, the world continues to sharpen itself, indifferent to pedigree, impatient with delay, and increasingly hostile to those who arrive unprepared. There are words that shape a life more by their absence than their use. In the heir's world, no is one of them. From early childhood onward, refusal is rare and always provisional. Requests are met with pauses, with negotiations, with gentle redirection, but seldom with finality. When denial does occur, it is framed as temporary, softened by promises of later approval. The heir does not learn that some things are impossible. He learns only that some things are delayed. This distinction matters more than anyone admits. In households where wealth cushions every edge, limits feel impolite. To say no too firmly risks discomfort, risks displeasing a child whose happiness is treated as both a duty and a reflection of family success. Parents, already distant through obligation or design, rely on intermediaries, nurses, tutors, attendants to manage friction. These intermediaries are trained to soothe, not to obstruct, and so the heir grows inside a world that yields. Desire meets little resistance. Curiosity is indulged. Excess is corrected quietly rather than confronted. Even misbehavior is reframed as personality, spiritedness, sensitivity, temperament. The language bends to preserve harmony. No one wishes to be remembered as the one who restricted the heir of a great name. The absence of no becomes a form of inheritance. It teaches the heir that wanting is sufficient justification, that persistence will be rewarded, that authority exists not to constrain, but to facilitate. When boundaries appear, they are negotiable. When obstacles arise, they are temporary. When discomfort threatens, it is removed. This lesson is reinforced everywhere. At school, teachers hesitate to fail. At home, Parents hesitate to forbid. In society, elders hesitate to criticize. The heir moves through institutions that bend subtly around him, mistaking courtesy for approval. Resistance feels personal, inappropriate, almost rude. And so he internalizes a dangerous belief that limits are unnatural. When frustration appears, it feels unjust. When denied, he assumes misunderstanding. He has never been trained to accept refusal as final, nor taught to recalibrate desire in the face of constraint. Adaptation has never been required. Accommodation has always arrived first. This produces confidence without calibration. The heir speaks decisively, acts impulsively, expects compliance. He does not feel entitled in his own mind, he feels normal. The world, as he has known it, has always responded. Why would it not continue to do so? The trouble begins when the world changes scale. Small indulgences become habits. Habits expand quietly into expectations. What was once a request becomes a requirement. Spending increases not because it feels reckless, but because it feels proportionate to status, to upbringing, to the standard of living always maintained. No one steps in to say stop. Advisors phrase concerns delicately. Family members hint rather than insist. Financial warnings are wrapped in reassurance, delivered alongside promises that matters remain under control. The word no never quite arrives. It circles the conversation, implied but unsaid, postponed until it loses force. By the time the heir encounters a true refusal from a bank, a creditor, a system that does not recognize pedigree, it feels not instructive, but hostile. He is unprepared for it. The first real no does not arrive as guidance. It arrives as shock. Accounts are frozen. Credit is denied. Doors close without explanation. The heir responds with disbelief rather than adjustment. He assumes error. He seeks correction, escalation, appeal. He waits for the familiar reversal that has always followed delay. It does not come. The absence of no in early life has left him without a vocabulary for limitation. He does not know how to reduce, how to retreat, how to accept less without interpreting it as failure or insult. He has been trained to continue, not to reconsider. And so he continues spending, maintaining, performing long after prudence would have intervened. The word no, when it finally asserts itself, arrives too late to instruct and too suddenly to soften. It feels punitive rather than protective. The heir does not learn from it. He is wounded by it. This is the quiet cruelty of indulgence without boundary. It postpones instruction until instruction can no longer help. The absence of no does not preserve happiness. It merely delays reckoning. And when reckoning arrives, it does so without manners. The fathers worked elsewhere. They rose early, left behind quiet breakfasts, and moved into a world of ledgers, steel, and risk. Their names appeared on prospectuses and contracts, carved into cornerstones and letterheads. They dealt in figures that rose and fell, in enterprises that demanded vigilance, patience, and a tolerance for uncertainty. These men understood volatility because they lived inside it. Their sons did not. At home, the results of that labor appeared fully formed: houses already furnished, tables already set, futures already arranged. The work itself remained abstract, spoken of only in fragments. Business was discussed as status rather than process, success as outcome rather than endurance. Fathers returned in the evening carrying the fatigue of responsibility, but rarely its explanation. The distance was structural. Many Gilded Age fortunes were built by men who had known scarcity, or at least proximity to it. They remembered precarious beginnings, the early years when failure would have been catastrophic. Their discipline had been forged under pressure. But having survived that uncertainty, they sought to spare their children from it entirely. This generosity proved asymmetrical. Fathers offered comfort instead of instruction, assurance instead of exposure. They provided without requiring comprehension. It seemed unkind, almost cruel, to burden sons with the anxieties that had consumed their own youth. Better, they believed, to let the next generation enjoy what had been secured, and so the sons learned consumption in isolation from creation. They saw wealth as a finished object rather than a living system. The family fortune felt static, almost inert, something that existed independently of effort. Railroads ran, factories produced, dividends arrived, all without visible intervention. The son did not witness negotiations, downturns, failures narrowly avoided. He saw only stability. This separation distorted scale. A father who measured success in margins and months saw spending as something to be managed carefully. A son, raised inside abundance, saw spending as expression of taste, of belonging, of identity. The same sum meant entirely different things to each. What one guarded, the other distributed casually. When fathers attempted correction, it often came too late. Conversations about responsibility were framed as reminders, not demands. Warnings were phrased diplomatically, softened by affection and pride. Sons were praised for confidence, for ease, for social fluency, the very traits that made restraint feel unnecessary. Criticism, when offered, felt out of character, even disloyal. Fathers hesitated to confront. To challenge a son's habits felt like questioning one's own legacy. After all, the wealth existed because of the father's success. To suggest it could be squandered felt like admitting fragility both of the fortune and of the father's achievement. Better to trust continuity. Better to believe that inheritance would naturally produce stewardship. It rarely did. As sons grew into men, the gap widened. Fathers continued to think in terms of preservation. Sons thought in terms of maintenance, keeping up appearances, sustaining lifestyles, honoring a standard rather than a balance sheet. The fortune was no longer a project, it was a performance. When fathers aged, responsibility transferred abruptly. There was often no gradual apprenticeship, no phased exposure. Control passed suddenly, through documents and ceremonies, rather than practice. The son inherited not just assets, but systems he did not understand. The weight was immense, but its mechanisms remained opaque. In some cases, fathers lived long enough to witness decline. They watched with confusion as expenditures rose, as caution eroded, as habits hardened. Yet even then, intervention felt intrusive. The son was an adult now, entitled to autonomy. Correction risked resentment. Silence felt easier. And so the pattern completed itself. Fathers who had built empires through vigilance entrusted them to sons raised without urgency. Builders handed over to spenders not out of negligence, but out of hope that comfort would mature into wisdom, that inheritance would teach what exposure had taught them. It did not. The sons spent not because they were malicious, but because spending was the only relationship to money they had ever known. They did not sabotage the fortune. They consumed it confidently, politely, without panic. By the time the fathers were gone, the distinction between building and spending had already been lost. What remained was a name, a lifestyle, and a fortune slowly dissolving under hands that had never been taught how to hold it still. If the father's world was risk, the mother's was protection. She presided over the interior, the rooms, the rhythms, the social weather that surrounded the heir from infancy onward. While fortunes were built elsewhere, refinement was cultivated here. The mother's task was not to explain money, but to soften life, to ensure that nothing sharp reached the child unmediated. In this, she was diligent, tireless, and often praised. Refinement became a shield. From an early age, the heir learned how to sit, how to speak, how to move through a room without causing offense. Emotions were regulated gently. Discomfort was redirected. Embarrassment was smoothed over before it could settle. The mother understood the social costs of visible struggle, and she was determined that her child would never pay them. This vigilance was mistaken for wisdom. In Gilded Age society, refinement carried moral weight. It signaled worthiness, breeding, and control. A well-mannered child reflected well on the household, and by extension, on the mother herself. Correct behavior mattered more than correct decisions. Appearance outweighed process. A child who behaved elegantly was assumed to be thriving. Problems, therefore, were addressed cosmetically. If the heir overspent, it was reframed as generosity. If he avoided responsibility, it was described as sensitivity. If he showed restlessness or excess, it was treated as temperament rather than warning. Mothers learned to translate concern into reassurance, to reinterpret danger as refinement gone slightly awry. They did this out of love. Many mothers had married into wealth rather than built it. Their authority lay not in ledgers or contracts, but in social intelligence. They understood reputation intimately, how quickly it could be damaged, how carefully it must be maintained. To allow a child to experience public failure felt reckless, even cruel, and so failure was hidden. Private tutors replaced public embarrassment. Quiet payments resolved visible mistakes. Explanations were offered to friends, neighbors, relatives, always tasteful, always plausible. The heir was spared confrontation not because he was incapable, but because confrontation threatened the family's polished surface. This protection extended well into adulthood. Even as sons grew older, mothers continued to intervene discreetly. Invitations were managed, introductions curated, warnings softened into suggestions. The heir remained insulated from direct consequence, guided instead by tone, by implication, by the gentle pressure of social expectation. Refinement became the lens through which all behavior was judged. If something looked acceptable, it was allowed to persist. If it felt uncomfortable, it was adjusted. Moral clarity gave way to aesthetic judgment. The question was no longer whether a choice was sustainable, but whether it appeared respectable. This proved disastrous when circumstances shifted. As fortunes thinned, refinement became more labor-intensive. Appearances required increasing effort. More care was needed to disguise less money. Mothers worked harder to preserve the illusion, tightening schedules, reducing visibility, managing explanations with greater precision. In doing so, they delayed recognition. The heir, shielded from blunt truth, continued to behave as though nothing fundamental had changed. Signals were filtered, warnings translated. Reality arrived only in fragments, too small to provoke adjustment. By the time the shield began to crack, the heir lacked the resilience to respond. Mothers had done what society asked of them. They had produced polished children, adept in manners, fluent in social codes. But refinement, when used as insulation rather than preparation, proved incapable of withstanding collapse. When money finally asserted its absence publicly, indisputably refinement offered no defense. The shield that had protected the heir from embarrassment now protected him from understanding, and understanding, once delayed too long, cannot arrive gently. The mother's care had preserved comfort. It had not preserved capability, and when the surface finally failed, there was nothing beneath it strong enough to hold the weight. By the time the heir is fully grown, his function has been quietly decided. He is not expected to build. He is not required to manage. He is meant to appear, to occupy rooms gracefully, to reassure investors, relatives, and society itself that continuity remains intact. His presence is symbolic long before it is practical. The heir becomes an ornament. At dinners he is seated where he can be seen. At gatherings his arrival is noted, his posture assessed, his manners quietly approved. He is introduced with care, his name carrying the weight of past achievements that are no longer actively maintained. His role is not to speak with authority, but to signal stability simply by existing. This expectation is never stated aloud. It is communicated through glances, arrangements, and omissions. Serious discussions occur elsewhere behind closed doors, between older men who still speak the language of risk and control. The heir is spared these conversations not because he is incapable, but because his value lies in being untroubled by them. Concern would mar the surface. In Gilded Age society, the appearance of ease mattered deeply. A relaxed heir suggested that everything beneath him was secure. Anxiety implied weakness. In this way, the heir's composure became a form of currency traded quietly in social and financial circles. As long as he looked confident, others assumed confidence was justified. And so the heir learned to perform calm. He mastered the art of effortless presence. He learned to laugh lightly at serious matters, to deflect questions with charm, to glide through situations without committing to decisions. Responsibility, when offered, was accepted ceremonially and delegated immediately. He did not refuse authority, he neutralized it. This performance was rewarded. Doors opened, invitations multiplied, advisors softened their tone. No one wanted to burden the ornament with weight. The heir's value lay in not disturbing the illusion of continuity. His job was to reassure, not to inquire. Over time, this role hardened into identity. The heir stopped seeing himself as a participant in the machinery of wealth. He became its representative instead. The fortune existed somewhere behind him, like a painted backdrop, impressive, assumed, rarely inspected closely. He stood in front of it, absorbing attention while its foundations quietly shifted. The danger of ornamentation is stagnation. An ornament does not adapt. It does not correct. It does not intervene. It exists to be preserved, not to preserve anything else. By treating the heir as a symbol rather than a steward, the family ensured that when action was finally required, he would be ill-equipped to provide it. This became most apparent during moments of strain. When markets trembled, when revenues tightened, when letters from bankers arrived with careful phrasing, the heir was shielded. There is no need to trouble him, someone would say. He has enough on his mind. The illusion had to be maintained at all costs, even if maintaining it required withholding truth. And so the heir remained serene. He continued to host, to attend, to spend. The ornament was polished more frequently as the structure behind it weakened. Appearances grew more elaborate, just as substance thinned. The effort required to look unchanged increased, but the heir was trained to interpret effort as refinement, not warning. By the time cracks became visible, the role itself became a trap. To acknowledge trouble would be to abandon the ornament's function. It would signal instability, provoke scrutiny, invite questions that could no longer be answered comfortably. The heir, accustomed to being admired rather than consulted, hesitated to step forward as a decision-maker. He did not know how. Years of being ornamental had trained him out of urgency, out of intervention, out of responsibility. Action felt inappropriate, almost vulgar. Better to maintain composure. Better to let others handle matters quietly. But the others were gone, retiring, dying, or retreating. When the moment finally arrived that required the heir to become more than a symbol, the transition was impossible. He had been raised to stand still while the world moved around him. He had never learned to move with it. The ornament remained beautiful, but it could not hold the structure upright. And as the fortune began to fail visibly, the heir stood exactly as he had been trained, present, composed, and utterly powerless to stop what was coming next. The most dangerous belief was never spoken aloud. It lived quietly beneath routines, beneath habits, beneath the unquestioned rhythm of days that resembled one another too closely. The fortune did not feel large or fragile or earned. It felt structural, like stone, like gravity, like something that would continue whether attended to or not. It felt permanent. In the heir's mind, money was not an object that could be lost. It was a condition of existence. Houses did not stand because they were maintained. They stood because they always had. Staff did not arrive because wages were paid, they arrived because that was how mornings worked. Bills were not settled through effort, they were absorbed somewhere beyond sight, as effortlessly as dust was removed from furniture. This belief was reinforced daily. There was no visible connection between behavior and outcome. A lavish evening produced no visible penalty the following morning. A reckless purchase did not alter the household's rhythm. A season of indulgence passed without consequence. The fortune responded not at all, remaining silent and intact. Silence became evidence. When nothing objected, nothing corrected, nothing failed, the heir concluded reasonably, from his perspective, that nothing could fail. The fortune appeared immune to misuse. It tolerated extravagance. It corrected imbalance. It forgave error. Over time, this tolerance was mistaken for infinite capacity. Even those who knew better spoke carefully. Advisors chose their words with precision, avoiding urgency. Family members framed concerns as observations rather than warnings. Phrases like temporary fluctuation and market adjustment replaced blunt language. Everyone behaved as though acknowledging fragility might summon it. And so fragility went unnamed. The heir absorbed reassurance as fact. He was told that the family had weathered crises before, that downturns were natural, that wealth this established did not vanish suddenly. These statements were not false, but they were incomplete. They omitted the labor, vigilance, and intervention that had once kept the fortune intact. What the heir learned was confidence without context. He learned that history guaranteed continuity, that pedigree functioned as protection. The past was treated as proof rather than warning. Portraits on the walls suggested endurance, not effort. The story of the fortune became static, something that had happened, not something that needed to keep happening. Permanence shaped behavior subtly. Why hurry when there is time? Why economize when stability feels assured? Why change when continuity has always followed? The heir did not consciously reject caution. He simply never felt its necessity. Prudence seemed like a response to danger, and danger never appeared. The illusion deepened as the world modernized. New technologies, expanding markets, and increasing financial complexity gave the impression that money itself had become more reliable. Systems grew larger, institutions more sophisticated. Risk appeared distributed, diluted, distant. The fortune was now embedded in structures too vast to imagine failing. This scale bred complacency. The heir assumed that even if one stream faltered, another would compensate. Losses felt abstract, buried in reports and summaries he did not read closely. Numbers moved, but life remained unchanged. The house stayed warm. Invitations continued. Credit remained available. The fortune did not announce its thinning. It never does. Decline arrived not as catastrophe, but as quiet adjustment, slight reductions, easily explained, minor sales, framed as strategy, subtle economies, disguised as preference. Each change was small enough to ignore, reasonable enough to accept. Together, they formed a pattern. But patterns require attention to be recognized, and attention had never been demanded of the heir. He lived inside continuity so convincing that interruption felt inconceivable. Even as margins narrowed, even as buffers thinned, the fortune continued to perform its most important function, preserving the illusion of permanence. By the time reality pressed hard enough to be felt, the belief was already ingrained. The heir did not prepare for loss because loss did not fit the story he had been given. He did not adapt because adaptation implied vulnerability. He did not retreat because retreat suggested failure. He continued as before. The fortune, once resilient through care and vigilance, now endured only through momentum. And momentum, unlike permanence, eventually exhausts itself. When the illusion finally collapsed, it would not do so gently. But for now, the rooms remained warm. The clocks continued to tick. and the heir lived comfortably inside the most convincing fiction of all, that what had always been would always be. Excess does not announce itself as danger. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine, poured into crystal flutes before noon and treated as punctuation rather than indulgence. Champagne, once reserved for milestones and victories, becomes merely another item on the day's ledger, ordered without thought, consumed without ceremony, forgotten almost immediately. This is how luxury loses its warning. In the heir's household, champagne is no longer celebration, it is reassurance, a signal that nothing has changed, that life continues at the expected pitch. Bottles arrive chilled, opened smoothly, refilled as glasses empty. The act carries no thrill, no hesitation. It is as ordinary as tea once was to another class entirely. The shift is subtle but decisive. What was once rare becomes ambient. Pleasure no longer punctuates time, it fills it. The heir drinks not to mark an occasion, but to maintain a feeling, a gentle, buoyant sense that the world remains pliable, agreeable, under control. Champagne smooths edges, it quiets questions. It softens the faint discomfort that sometimes flickers when ledgers are mentioned or letters arrive unopened. Expense becomes atmosphere. No one tallies the cost at the table. Bills are addressed later, elsewhere, by someone else. The heir sees only the ritual, not the accumulation. A bottle feels insignificant. A case feels manageable. A cellar stocked for convenience does not register as commitment. Money, after all, has always absorbed such gestures. What changes is not the amount spent, but the meaning of spending. When luxury becomes daily, restraint loses its vocabulary. There is no longer a distinction between need and indulgence, only preference. The heir begins to measure days not by productivity or purpose, but by comfort. A successful day is one that proceeds without friction, without denial, without interruption. Champagne becomes part of this maintenance. It accompanies lunches that stretch long into the afternoon. It appears at dinners meant to distract from quiet anxieties. It lubricates conversations that avoid substance. It is offered generously, almost compulsively, as though hospitality itself might hold the world together. Guests rarely refuse. To decline would suggest concern, and concern feels inappropriate in such surroundings. Everyone participates in the ritual, reinforcing the shared illusion that abundance remains intact. The heir reads this participation as confirmation. If others drink freely, surely everything is fine. But indulgence accumulates silently. Each bottle represents not extravagance, but assumption. Assumption that funds are sufficient. Assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. Assumption that someone, somewhere, is monitoring the balance. These assumptions stack atop one another, forming a fragile structure of confidence unsupported by calculation. When small economies are suggested, they are dismissed politely. Why deny pleasure when life has been built to accommodate it? Why alter habits when nothing has yet gone wrong? Champagne, after all, is not ruinous by itself. It is merely symbolic, one more gesture in a life designed around ease. That symbolism matters. Champagne signals immunity. It declares that the heir remains untouched by limitation. To stop drinking, it would be to acknowledge constraint, and acknowledgement feels dangerously close to admission. Better to continue. Better to maintain the rhythm. Better to keep the glasses full. As expenses rise, awareness dulls. The heir no longer notices prices. He orders reflexively, guided by habit rather than intention. The line between celebration and sedation blurs. Champagne soothes not just nerves, but perception. It makes decline feel slower, softer, almost reversible, until it isn't. One day, a bottle fails to arrive promptly. A preferred label is unavailable. A bill takes longer to resolve. These moments register as irritations, not warnings. The heir adjusts temporarily. never considering that adjustment itself is the signal. By the time champagne ceases to be daily, it will not be by choice. The ritual will end abruptly, replaced not by moderation but by absence, and in that absence, the air will feel something unfamiliar: exposure. The quiet realization that pleasure had been standing in for security, and that without it, the illusion weakens dangerously. For now, however, the glasses remain filled. The bubbles rise, effervescent and fleeting, each one a tiny reminder unnoticed that nothing meant to last forever should be consumed as though it will. Stillness invites thought. Motion dissolves it. For the air, movement becomes preference long before it becomes necessity. Horses are acquired not for labor, but for speed and display. Yachts are commissioned not for travel, but for escape. The body is kept in motion, so the mind never settles long enough to ask unwelcome questions. Endless motion becomes strategy. In the Gilded Age, wealth expresses itself through velocity, the ability to move across land, across water, across seasons signals command. The heir rides because riding suggests vitality. He sails because sailing implies mastery over distance itself. Motion reassures both observer and participant that control remains intact. A stationary fortune invites inspection. A moving one dazzles. Horses require stables, grooms, trainers, transport. Each expense arrives with ceremony, justified as tradition, as sport, as cultivation of character. Riding teaches discipline, it is said. It builds confidence. It maintains health. These statements are not untrue, but they are incomplete. Riding also absorbs time, money, and attention without ever demanding accounting. Yachts do the same on a grander scale. They are floating rooms, insulated from land-bound concerns. On deck, the horizon expands while responsibility contracts. Servants manage logistics. Crews handle maintenance. The air experiences only the surface, the breeze, the polished rail, the gentle illusion of command as orders are relayed and executed. Motion feels like progress. The air convinces himself that movement equals activity, that activity equals engagement. Days blur into journeys. Journeys replace decisions. There is always another destination, another race, another season to chase. Motion prevents stagnation, but it also prevents reckoning. Financial conversations do not travel well. They are easily postponed until after the ride, after the voyage, after the return. And upon return, another departure is already planned. The calendar fills with motion, leaving no space for stillness, and therefore no space for clarity. Endless motion becomes a form of anesthesia. Like ether administered carefully, it dulls discomfort without curing its source. The air senses pressure at the edges, whispers of cost, hints of reduction, but movement softens these signals. Problems feel distant when one is always elsewhere. The culture encourages this escape. Society applauds the restless air. His travels are admired, his horses discussed, his yacht photographed. Motion becomes reputation, and reputation becomes reinforcement. As long as he is seen moving confidently through the world, no one questions where he is headed. Maintenance quietly escalates. Horses age, yachts require refitting, crews expect loyalty. Each moving part introduces new dependencies. Motion, once liberating, becomes binding. The heir must keep moving to justify what he owns. Stopping would reveal cost. Stopping would invite calculation. So he does not stop. He rides longer, sails farther, stays away longer than intended. The world becomes a blur of corridors, docks, tracks, and ports, all familiar, all strangely interchangeable. Everywhere feels like nowhere. Motion erases context. When exhaustion arrives, it is treated as inconvenience. The air rests briefly, then resumes. To pause too long would allow stillness to do its work. and stillness, unmediated, is dangerous. It encourages comparison between income and outflow, between appearance and reality, between what remains and what is being spent to maintain motion itself. The irony is complete. Motion, meant to signify freedom, becomes obligation. Horses must be fed, yachts must be crewed, schedules must be honored. The heir moves not because he wishes to, but because stopping would expose the cost of having moved so far without direction. When motion finally slows, it will not be voluntary. Funds will tighten, sales will be required. Assets once used to flee reality will be relinquished reluctantly, each loss felt as humiliation rather than relief. The heir will mourn the horses and yachts as symbols of identity, never fully acknowledging that they were also instruments of delay. For now, the world keeps moving beneath his feet. The hooves strike, the water parts, the horizon retreats. And as long as motion continues, the reckoning remains just out of sight, always behind him, never faced directly, waiting patiently for the moment when there is nowhere left to go. Certain cities did not merely permit extravagance, they required it. The heir learned this instinctively the moment he arrived. New York, Paris, Newport. Each city presented itself as a stage upon which restraint looked misplaced. Lights burned late, shops stayed open, doors revolved endlessly. The city did not ask what one intended to spend, it asked only how quickly one could adapt to its tempo. In these places, spending felt participatory. To move through the city without purchasing anything was to move incorrectly. Cafes invited lingering. Boutiques demanded inspection. Carriages waited expectantly. Every surface reflected abundance back at the heir, reinforcing the sense that expenditure was not indulgence but etiquette. The city taught him how to belong. Urban life in the Gilded Age was carefully engineered to separate money from effort. Goods appeared already refined. Meals arrived fully prepared. Entertainment unfolded nightly without repetition. The heir experienced consumption as culture, not transaction. Prices were softened by presentation, obscured by elegance, justified by novelty. Spending became interaction. A dinner was not sustenance, it was social positioning. Clothing was not necessity, it was declaration. Apartments, clubs, hotels, each offered a tiered experience calibrated to how much one was willing to release without thinking too closely about where it went. The city rewarded momentum. Those who hesitated appeared provincial. Those who questioned cost looked uncertain. Confidence was measured by speed, how quickly one ordered, how decisively one upgraded, how casually one dismissed the bill. The heir learned to move fluidly, to signal ease through expenditure, to let money fall away without pause. No one interrupted this education. Clerks were deferential. Hosts were accommodating. Credit was extended generously, sometimes eagerly, as though the city itself wished to keep the heir moving. Financial caution was treated as a failure of imagination rather than a virtue. The city did not punish excess. It absorbed it. One could overspend quietly for years without visible consequence. A new venue replaced the last. A different neighborhood offered distraction. Losses were diluted by novelty. The city made it easy to forget yesterday's expense by overwhelming the senses today. This environment shaped perception profoundly. The heir began to associate money with access rather than limit. As long as he could enter the right rooms, the right circles, the right conversations, he assumed solvency remained intact. Visibility replaced accounting. If one was still seen, one was still secure. Cities excel at preserving illusion. They are large enough to hide decline. One can downsize discreetly, move addresses, adjust habits without explanation. A smaller apartment still feels luxurious when surrounded by spectacle. A reduced wardrobe still appears ample under bright lights. The heir mistook adaptability for sustainability. He learned to shift rather than to stop, to substitute rather than to confront. When expenses grew uncomfortable, he changed venues. When routines felt strained, he relocated. The city offered endless variation, allowing the same behavior to continue under different names. But cities also accelerate erosion. Everything costs more, not just money, but attention, energy, restraint. The pressure to participate never relents. Even moderation requires effort. To live quietly in a city built for display is itself exhausting. The heir, already trained to equate spending with belonging, found it easier to comply than to resist. And so, compliance became habit. Years passed in a blur of dinners, openings, journeys between districts. Each experience justified the last. Each expense felt proportionate to the environment. The city made extravagance feel contextual rather than excessive. Only later would the arithmetic become unavoidable. When accounts tightened, the city did not soften. It simply moved on. Venues closed, invitations thinned, familiar faces became less available. The heir discovered that the city had never been loyal, only accommodating. For now, however, it continued to glow. The lights remained bright. The doors remained open. The heir walked its streets, believing that the city's abundance reflected his own. He did not yet understand that cities do not encourage spending out of kindness. They do so because they know, better than anyone, how easily money forgets where it came from once it begins to move. Credit arrived with a smile. It was never introduced as debt, never framed as obligation. It appeared instead as recognition, a nod of familiarity, a quiet acknowledgement of status. Accounts were opened not with scrutiny, but with trust. Signatures were accepted without insistence. Names carried weight enough to replace collateral. Credit, in the heir's world, felt like manners. Shopkeepers extended it politely, almost eagerly. Hotels recorded preferences rather than limits. Clubs deferred payment indefinitely, folding expense into membership as though money itself were merely another social detail to be handled discreetly. No one spoke of balance. No one spoke of interest. The transaction ended the moment the service was rendered. This was not recklessness. It was etiquette. To ask for immediate payment would have been gauche, even insulting. It implied uncertainty, a lack of confidence in the continuity of the relationship. Credit preserved dignity for both parties. The heir was spared inconvenience. The merchant preserved the appearance of trust. Everyone behaved as though delay erased risk. Delay, however, merely disguised it. The heir grew accustomed to this gentility. He learned that obligations could be postponed indefinitely, without consequence. That settlement was a formality handled later, quietly, by someone else. Bills arrived softened by time, reduced to summaries, stripped of urgency. They were reviewed, perhaps, but rarely felt. Credit altered perception. When cost is removed from the moment of decision, spending loses its edge. The heir did not experience purchase as exchange, but as continuation. One thing followed another smoothly, uninterrupted by calculation. The absence of friction felt natural, reinforcing the belief that money was not being consumed so much as circulated. Courtesy became leverage. Merchants who extended credit became invested in the illusion of solvency. To press too hard would risk the relationship. To question too closely would invite refusal. And so they waited patiently at first, then nervously, then increasingly silently. The heir mistook this silence for approval. The ledger thickened quietly. Multiple accounts accumulated across cities, clubs, tailors, shipyards, stables. Each felt manageable in isolation. Together, they formed a web of deferred obligations so intricate that it resisted comprehension. The heir did not see the whole. He saw only moments, another purchase, another courtesy extended. When reminders came, they were phrased delicately. Whenever convenient. At your leisure. No immediate urgency. Language softened reality. The heir, insulated by tone, assumed flexibility, meant abundance. If payment could wait, surely resources remained sufficient. The very patience of creditors became proof of stability. This was the trap. Credit thrives on confidence. Once confidence falters, courtesy evaporates. But the transition is rarely announced. It arrives quietly, through subtle changes, a clerk's tone cooling, a request becoming more explicit, a line of credit reviewed rather than renewed. The heir noticed these shifts only dimly. He attributed them to mood, to misunderstanding, to temporary inconvenience. He had never been trained to interpret financial tension. No one had ever spoken plainly to him about limits. Credit had always been generous. Courtesy had always prevailed. Until it didn't, the first refusal felt personal. A service declined, a request delayed, an explanation offered where none had been required before. The heir responded with surprise rather than concern. Surely this was an error. Surely reputation would correct it. Surely the courtesy would return. But courtesy depends on expectation. Once expectation wavers, politeness becomes procedural. Accounts are reviewed. Terms are clarified. Interest appears where none had been noticed. The language changes, shedding its softness. The heir experiences this shift not as consequence, but as betrayal. He does not recognize his own role in the change. Credit had allowed him to live beyond awareness. It had preserved ease by deferring reckoning. But deferral is not forgiveness. It is merely time borrowed, accumulating weight as it passes. When the heir finally confronts the totality of what is owed, it feels sudden and unjust. He does not remember agreeing to such sums. He remembers only courtesies, gestures exchanged politely, without ceremony. But courtesies, once tallied, become demands. And demands do not respect tone. Credit, once offered as recognition, now reveals itself as exposure. The very system that preserved dignity begins to strip it away, insisting on clarity, on settlement, on finality. For the heir, this is the first moment when money speaks plainly. And by then, it is already too late to answer it with grace. Overspending rarely feels like excess at first. It begins as adjustment, small accommodations made in the name of comfort, propriety, or convenience. A slightly better room, a more reputable tailor, an additional carriage rather than a shared one. Each decision is defensible in isolation, framed as reasonable, even restrained. The heir does not believe he is spending too much. He believes he is spending correctly. This is the art of it. In the Gilded Age, true extravagance was considered vulgar. Loud displays invited scrutiny. Quiet elevation, however, passed unnoticed. The heir learned to refine rather than to flaunt, to improve the quality of his life incrementally, until expense felt indistinguishable from taste. Overspending thrives in increments. No single purchase alarms. Each upgrade seems minor compared to the last. The difference between acceptable and excessive is bridged gradually, without ceremony. Habits evolve slowly enough to escape detection, even by the one practicing them. The heir adjusts his expectations upward, recalibrating normal with each decision. What once felt indulgent now feels baseline. Rooms grow larger, dinners lengthen, travel becomes more private, more insulated, more expensive. Each change is justified by context, by peers who live similarly, by environments that demand participation at a certain level. The heir spends not to impress, but to avoid appearing diminished. This distinction matters deeply. To overspend flamboyantly is to invite judgment. To overspend gently is to blend in. The heir excels at blending in. His choices appear thoughtful, his expenditures measured. There is no sudden collapse, no reckless spree, only continuity, smooth, polite, increasingly unsustainable. The language around spending remains soothing. Words like investment, maintenance, expectation soften the reality. Even loss is reframed as adjustment. A costly habit is described as a lifestyle. A recurring expense is treated as commitment. The heir speaks of money in abstract terms, detached from totals, insulated from reckoning. He does not ask how much. He asks whether it feels appropriate. This approach is reinforced socially. Friends do not question one another's expenditures. To do so would be indelicate. Comparison occurs silently, through observation rather than discussion. If others maintain certain standards, the heir assumes he must as well. Spending becomes reciprocal, a shared agreement to uphold appearances collectively. Thus, overspending becomes collaborative. No one feels individually responsible because everyone is participating. The group normalizes excess by distributing it. The heir mistakes consensus for sustainability. If so many can afford this life, surely it is affordable. But not everyone is spending from the same source. Some earn, some invest, some calculate carefully. The heir, however, spends from assumption. His confidence is inherited, not earned. He does not notice when others moderate, when they retreat quietly, when they adjust without announcement. He continues as before, mistaking silence for sameness. The gentle art requires discipline of a peculiar kind. One must avoid obvious collapse. One must maintain composure. One must overspend without panic, without spectacle, without admitting that anything is wrong. The heir practices this instinctively. He trims where visible, indulges where private. He shifts rather than stops. But arithmetic does not respond to tone. Margins narrow imperceptibly at first, buffers thin. What was once absorbed now accumulates. The heir does not see this, because the experience of life remains unchanged. The house stays warm. The invitations continue. Credit still exists. Overspending becomes invisible precisely because it works for a while. The danger lies in how long it works. By the time discomfort appears, the habits are entrenched. The heir's identity is bound to the life he has been maintaining gently for years. To reduce it feels like self-erasure. To stop overspending would require not just financial adjustment, but social withdrawal, personal revision, and the admission that taste had quietly become appetite. He delays this admission as long as possible. When intervention is finally unavoidable, it arrives not as instruction but as rupture. The gentle art ceases to be gentle. Numbers assert themselves bluntly. The heir, practiced in refinement but not restraint, struggles to respond. Overspending did not ruin him overnight. It carried him there politely, one reasonable decision at a time, until reason itself could no longer keep pace with cost. Gambling entered the heir's life without urgency. It did not arrive through desperation or need, but through invitation, an evening game, a country weekend, a table arranged after dinner when conversation had softened and the lamps burned low. The sums were modest at first, almost symbolic. Losses were laughed away. Wins were treated as proof of charm rather than chance. Gambling felt social, not risky. In the Gilded Age, wagering among the wealthy carried none of the desperation associated with lower tables. There was no sweat, no panic, no visible fear. Stakes were calibrated to be absorbable, framed as entertainment rather than exposure. The heir learned quickly that gambling, done properly, was another way of belonging. He did not gamble to win. He gambled to participate, to demonstrate ease with uncertainty, to show that loss did not trouble him. The ability to lose gracefully was itself a signal of wealth. One could afford uncertainty if one believed the outcome would never matter. This belief proved intoxicating. Cards turned, dice fell. The heir learned to read faces, to bluff lightly, to accept a defeat without complaint. Losses disappeared into accounts already crowded with other courtesies. No immediate consequence followed. The experience remained pleasurable, controlled, civilized. Gambling without desperation teaches a dangerous lesson, that risk is decorative. The heir began to associate chance with amusement rather than threat. He did not fear volatility, he enjoyed its theater. Risk felt contained, bounded by politeness and mutual understanding. Everyone at the table behaved as though the stakes were imaginary, even when they were not. Over time, the sums grew. Not dramatically, but incrementally enough to keep interest alive. Larger losses still failed to provoke anxiety. They were smoothed by confidence, justified as anomalies, reframed as the price of participation. The heir never experienced the sharp corrective pain that teaches caution. There was always more behind it. The fortune, still assumed intact, absorbed these losses invisibly. Gambling did not yet threaten solvency. It merely contributed to erosion. The heir did not notice the thinning because the surface remained unchanged. He continued to live well, spend freely, move effortlessly through rooms designed to accommodate him. Gambling mirrored his broader financial life. Decisions were made without urgency. Outcomes were accepted without adjustment. Losses did not alter behavior. The heir developed a tolerance for uncertainty that bordered on indifference. He did not hedge. He did not withdraw. He trusted that the system would correct itself. This confidence extended beyond the table. The heir began to treat other financial decisions similarly, investments chosen for excitement rather than analysis, ventures entered casually, risks taken without calculation. Gambling had trained him to believe that chance favored composure, that fortune rewarded those who did not flinch. But chance does not remember demeanor. When losses accumulated more noticeably, they still failed to produce panic. The heir had never learned to associate loss with danger. He had learned to associate it with continuity. One lost, one paid, one continued. The rhythm remained unbroken. Others noticed sooner. Friends moderated. Invitations grew selective. Tables thinned quietly. Those who gambled as entertainment knew when to stop. The heir did not notice these departures. He mistook their absence for coincidence, not caution. When desperation finally appeared, it was unfamiliar. It did not announce itself loudly. It arrived as irritation, as restlessness, as the faint sense that winning would now help. This was new. Gambling, once recreational, now carried expectation. The heir did not recognize this shift immediately, but the table did. Gambling without desperation had prepared him poorly for the moment desperation arrived. He lacked restraint, lacked exit strategy, lacked humility before probability. What had once been social theater now became exposure. The losses mattered now, and the system no longer absorbed them quietly. The heir still sat confidently, still smiled, still wagered as though nothing had changed. But beneath the composure, something essential had shifted. For the first time, chance was no longer decorative. It was beginning to speak plainly. And unlike the heir, chance had never cared whether he appeared calm. Marriage, in the heir's world, was never merely personal. It arrived wrapped in expectation, staged carefully, discussed in advance by voices that did not belong to the couple themselves. Love was permitted, encouraged, even but only within boundaries already drawn. A suitable marriage did not secure happiness. It secured continuity. It reassured society that the line would hold. Marriage became performance. The courtship unfolded publicly. Dinners were arranged, introductions choreographed. Approval traveled quietly through families long before vows were spoken. The heir learned quickly that marriage was not an end, but a signal, a declaration that the fortune remained stable enough to support another household, another set of appearances. The wedding itself functioned as evidence. Ballrooms were filled. Invitations extended widely. Expense was deliberate and conspicuous. No one economized on a wedding meant to silence doubt. The scale of the celebration mattered more than its sentiment. It demonstrated capacity. It reassured creditors, relatives, and peers alike. Afterward, the theatre continued. A new residence was required, appropriately sized, appropriately furnished. Staff expanded, social obligations multiplied. The couple was expected to entertain, to host, to maintain a rhythm that confirmed prosperity. Marriage did not simplify the heir's life, it amplified it. Spending became shared ritual. 2 wardrobes replaced 1. 2 sets of expectations overlapped. Each partner brought habits shaped by similar insulation, similar assumptions. Neither had been trained to reduce. Neither felt authorized to suggest restraint. To economize felt like admitting weakness, both personal and familial. Marriage encouraged escalation. New expenses were justified as harmony. If one desired a certain standard, the other complied. Disagreement about money felt indelicate, even threatening. It implied instability. Better to spend than to confront. Better to preserve the appearance of unity than to examine the cost of maintaining it. This dynamic proved dangerous. Marriage, once intended to consolidate wealth, now consumed it. Alliances that looked advantageous on paper drained resources quietly through duplicated lifestyles and competing social demands. The heir mistook partnership for reinforcement. In reality, it doubled exposure. Financial discussions were avoided. To speak plainly about money risked discomfort, resentment, even rupture. Couples learned to communicate around finances rather than through them. Decisions were made implicitly, through habit rather than agreement. No one wanted to be the one who introduced anxiety into the marriage. So anxiety was displaced. It appeared as tension, as distraction, as restlessness. One partner traveled more, the other entertained excessively. Both sought reassurance through spending, as though money itself might stabilize what was beginning to feel uncertain. Outwardly, everything remained correct. The couple attended functions together. They smiled appropriately. Their home reflected taste. Friends spoke approvingly. Society accepted the marriage as successful because it looked successful. Financial strain, still largely invisible, did not yet intrude upon the surface. But surfaces require maintenance. As resources thinned, the effort to appear unchanged increased. More energy went into concealment. Explanations multiplied. Adjustments were framed as preference. Nothing was ever described as necessity. Marriage became a cooperative effort to maintain illusion. In some cases, the theatre failed privately before it failed publicly. Arguments surfaced behind closed doors. One partner sensed decline before the other. Resentment grew not because money was gone, but because it could no longer fulfill its role as buffer. The marriage, built partly on assumption, began to strain under reality. Yet even then, separation felt impossible. Divorce carried scandal. Scandal threatened reputation. Reputation remained the last remaining asset. Better to remain together, spending whatever was necessary to preserve the appearance of unity. Thus marriage, once meant to secure the future, accelerated its unraveling. It demanded scale where scale was no longer sustainable. It multiplied obligations at the precise moment restraint was needed, and it discouraged honest reckoning by framing confrontation as failure. When collapse finally arrived, it did not announce itself as marital breakdown. It arrived as numbers, as letters, as doors closing politely but firmly. The marriage, stripped of its financial theatre, stood exposed, 2 people facing consequences. Neither had ever been trained to discuss openly. The vows had promised continuity. They had not prepared either of them for what happened when continuity quietly ran out. Entertaining begins as pleasure, then becomes obligation. In the heir's world, the open door is never merely generous. It is declarative. To host is to announce presence, to insist quietly that one still matters. Invitations circulate as proof of vitality. A house that entertains is a house assumed to be solvent, and so the heir entertains. Dinners grow elaborate not from joy, but from necessity. Guest lists lengthen, courses multiply, wines improve in reputation if not in wisdom. Each evening becomes a performance calibrated to reassure an audience that watches more closely than it admits. The table does not exist to nourish, it exists to signal. Relevance requires witnesses. In Gilded Age society, invisibility is interpreted as decline. Absence invites speculation. Silence breeds rumor. To withdraw from entertaining is to suggest uncertainty, and uncertainty is fatal to reputation. The heir understands this instinctively. When doubts begin to circulate, faint, polite, unspoken, he responds not with restraint, but with spectacle. The parties become louder. Music fills rooms that once relied on conversation. Flowers arrive in excess, replaced before wilting. Candles burn in numbers meant to suggest abundance rather than warmth. Everything is arranged to look effortless, even as effort intensifies behind the scenes. Entertaining becomes defensive. Each successful evening feels like a reprieve. As long as guests attend, as long as they linger, as long as they compliment the setting and accept the hospitality without hesitation, the heir believes the illusion remains intact. Applause, however subtle, is mistaken for confirmation. But entertaining is expensive in ways that compound quickly. Food, staff, decoration, maintenance, each gathering demands repetition. Nothing can be reused too obviously. Novelty must be preserved. Familiarity dulls impact. The heir spends not because he enjoys it, but because he fears what stopping would imply. Hospitality becomes a shield. It deflects questions. It replaces conversation about substance with conversation about experience. Guests leave satisfied, distracted, reassured. They do not ask how things are going. They comment on the dessert, the view, the music. The heir listens carefully, collecting these responses as evidence that all is well. Yet entertaining invites comparison. Other houses host too. Other tables compete. The heir measures himself against peers who may be economizing quietly, hosting less frequently, or supplementing income through means he does not see. He responds by matching their scale without matching their resources. This is how entertaining becomes escalation. One cannot host modestly when modesty reads as retreat. One cannot simplify when simplicity suggests constraint. The heir learns to spend aggressively to maintain parity, believing that relevance itself depends on scale. The calendar fills relentlessly. One event requires another to follow. Gaps invite notice. The heir becomes trapped by his own hospitality, obligated to continue lest interruption invites scrutiny. Even exhaustion becomes a liability. To appear tired is to appear strained. Behind the scenes, staff feel the pressure first. Budgets tighten. Instructions become contradictory. Maintain standards, reduce costs. Corners are trimmed invisibly. Quality slips quietly. The heir notices only when forced to, and then corrects by spending more, not less. Entertaining ceases to be communal. It becomes isolating. The heir hosts constantly but speaks honestly to no one. Conversations skim surfaces. Guests enjoy themselves without sensing the urgency beneath the arrangement. The heir stands at the center, smiling, present, increasingly alone. When invitations begin to decline, the shift is subtle. A guest arrives late, another leaves early. Compliments grow vague. The energy changes. The heir responds by increasing effort, more expense, more spectacle, more insistence. He does not recognize that relevance cannot be purchased indefinitely. Eventually, entertaining fails in its purpose. A lavish evening no longer reassures. It raises questions instead. Observers wonder how such expense is sustained. Spectacle becomes suspicious. The very act meant to assert stability begins to suggest desperation. The heir senses this too late. Entertaining, once a pleasure and then a strategy, becomes a liability. It accelerates depletion while delaying acknowledgement. The house remains full even as accounts empty. The performance continues long after the means to support it have thinned. When entertaining finally stops, it does not stop gradually. It ends abruptly with excuses, with closures, with explanations no longer convincing. The silence that follows feels louder than any party ever did. And in that silence, relevance evaporates quickly. The heir discovers that entertaining was never about generosity or joy. It was about being seen. And once the seeing ends, the illusion it sustained collapses with startling speed. The first sale is never announced. It occurs quietly, almost apologetically, framed as discretion rather than necessity. The object chosen is not central, nothing irreplaceable, nothing that might provoke comment. It is something admired but not essential, valued but not revered, an heirloom that has lived on the margins long enough to be mistaken for excess. The heir tells himself it is sensible. There is language for this moment, carefully selected to avoid alarm. Consolidation, reallocation, practicality. The sale is not framed as loss, but as tidying an adjustment meant to improve efficiency, to reduce clutter. It is spoken of as taste refining itself, not as resources thinning. The object is handled gently. It is wrapped, appraised, discussed in hushed tones. Experts are consulted, men with soft voices and practiced neutrality. They speak of provenance, of condition, of market timing. Their professionalism reassures. The heir listens carefully, grateful for the structure these conversations provide. Structure feels stabilizing. The sale is conducted discreetly. No auction, no spectacle. A private buyer is found. Papers are signed. Funds transfer cleanly. The process is smooth enough to suggest control. The heir experiences relief not because money has been gained, but because nothing visibly collapsed. This relief is dangerous. It teaches the wrong lesson. The sale did not hurt. It did not provoke shame or scandal. Life continues unchanged. The house remains warm. Invitations persist. Staff behave as before. The heir concludes again, reasonably, that the system works. One can sell without consequence. Heirlooms, after all, were made to be enjoyed, not worshipped. Why preserve everything unchanged? Why cling sentimentally when value can be converted into flexibility? The logic is soothing. It frames liquidation as sophistication rather than surrender. The family history is revised subtly. The heir begins to see objects not as anchors, but as options. Paintings become assets. Jewelry becomes liquidity. Furniture becomes negotiable. The emotional distance required to sell one item makes the next sale easier. Memory becomes monetizable. The first sale changes the atmosphere of the house imperceptibly. There is more space, fewer reminders. The absence feels temporary, intentional. Guests do not comment. If they notice, they assume curation rather than contraction. This silence reinforces the pattern. No one objects, no one intervenes. Advisors nod approvingly. The heir feels validated, even clever. He has solved a problem quietly. He has preserved appearances without altering habits. The funds are absorbed quickly. They address several small pressures at once, settling accounts, smoothing over recent excess, restoring a sense of margin. The relief is immediate and convincing. The heir breathes easier. He tells himself the matter is closed. But something has shifted. The line that once felt unthinkable has now been crossed. The house has proven it can lose something and survive. The heir's sense of permanence adjusts accordingly. What was once fixed now feels flexible. What was once untouchable now feels conditional. This flexibility expands. The next heirloom sold requires less deliberation. The language becomes more efficient. The process more familiar. Each sale produces the same short-term calm, the same illusion of correction. The heir begins to rely on liquidation as strategy. He does not yet recognize it as retreat. Each object removed reduces not only the estate's substance, but its resistance. Heirlooms had functioned as ballast, symbols of continuity that discouraged drastic action. As they disappear, the estate becomes lighter, more responsive to pressure, less anchored to its past. The heir does not mourn immediately. Grief is postponed by practicality. He tells himself that meaning resides in memory, not in objects. This is true but incomplete. Objects had also served as boundaries, quietly insisting that some things were not to be converted. Once that boundary dissolves, nothing remains sacred for long. The first sale was small, rational, polite. It did not announce decline. It merely made it possible. From that point forward, every possession carries a question the heir had never before allowed himself to ask. What could this become if sold? And in that question, once entertained, lies the beginning of a very different relationship with the past, one in which inheritance is no longer preserved, but slowly, carefully exchanged for time. Numbers, once consulted, are difficult to forget. So the heir learns not to consult them. Instead, he lives off memory of balances that once existed, of figures that once reassured, of a past moment when the fortune felt unquestionably intact. Yesterday's numbers become reference points, repeated internally until they replace the present. The ledger is no longer a tool, it is a relic. This habit forms quietly. After the first sale of an heirloom, after the first subtle adjustment, the heir tells himself that matters are now stabilized. He remembers the sum that once sat comfortably in reserve. He recalls years when income exceeded expenditure without effort. These recollections harden into assumptions. The past becomes proxy for the present. The current figures are avoided. Statements arrive unopened or skimmed hastily. Summaries replace detail. Advisors offer updates softened by diplomacy, framed in comparison rather than clarity. Better than last quarter, not as severe as anticipated. The heir accepts these phrases eagerly, using them to support the narrative he prefers. Living off yesterday's numbers feels prudent. After all, fortunes do not vanish overnight. They decline gradually. There is time to adjust, time to correct, time to respond if necessary. The heir tells himself that vigilance can wait, that awareness itself is a form of alarm best postponed until absolutely required. This postponement becomes policy. Spending decisions are made based on what used to be affordable, not what currently is. A dinner feels reasonable because it would have been reasonable 5 years ago. A journey feels justified because it once fit comfortably within the margin. The heir spends from memory rather than calculation. Memory, however, does not account for erosion. Small losses, once absorbed effortlessly, now accumulate. Maintenance costs rise. Income streams thin. The heir does not track these changes because tracking would require attention, and attention would require acknowledgement. Instead, he relies on the reassuring echo of older figures. The danger lies in how convincing this echo becomes. Yesterday's numbers feel authoritative because they are known. Today's numbers feel provisional, subject to fluctuation, capable of improvement. The heir treats the present as temporary and the past as stable. This inversion allows him to continue unchanged. Even warnings are filtered through this logic. When concerns are raised, they are interpreted as short-term disturbances rather than structural shifts. We have weathered worse, the heir thinks, drawing on a past he did not personally manage. He believes resilience is inherent, not practiced. This belief delays adaptation. Opportunities to reduce, to simplify, to recalibrate are missed. Each moment of hesitation increases dependency on past assumptions. The heir becomes invested in the idea that the numbers will eventually return to their former state, restoring alignment between memory and reality. But numbers do not remember themselves. They reflect conditions, decisions, and time. Yesterday's figures belong to a world that no longer exists. Markets have shifted, costs have risen, habits have hardened. The fortune, once dynamic, has become reactive. Living off yesterday's numbers creates a widening gap. The heir feels solvent while becoming vulnerable. He feels secure while margins vanish. The discrepancy remains invisible until a specific limit is reached, one that cannot be deferred or softened. When that moment arrives, it feels abrupt. Accounts that once seemed generous are suddenly insufficient. Obligations converge. Options narrow. The heir experiences shock not because the decline was sudden, but because he had been living inside an outdated frame of reference. The realization is destabilizing. For the first time, the heir confronts the present without the cushion of memory. The numbers he avoided now assert themselves bluntly, stripped of nostalgia. They are smaller, tighter, less forgiving. Living off yesterday's numbers has preserved comfort at the cost of clarity. It allowed the heir to continue as before, while conditions changed beneath him. It postponed reckoning by substituting recollection for reality. And when reality finally intrudes, it does so without ceremony. The heir stands at the edge of a future he has not prepared for, holding figures that no longer correspond to his life, forced to confront the quiet truth that memory cannot pay what the present demands. The past, once reassuring, offers no further credit. From here on, only what remains will matter, and what remains is far less than the heir ever allowed himself to see. The letters do not arrive all at once. They slip into the household gradually, mixed among invitations, catalogues, correspondence of little consequence. Their envelopes are modest, their language restrained. Nothing in their appearance suggests urgency. They are designed, above all else, not to alarm. This restraint is deliberate. Bankers in the Gilded Age understand reputation as keenly as aristocrats do. A letter that sounds too loud risks offense. A tone too blunt threatens trust. And so concern is expressed politely, wrapped in courtesy, softened by reassurance. The heir reads phrases rather than messages, a routine review, a minor adjustment, an opportunity to discuss future arrangements. Nothing that requires immediate action. Nothing that sounds like danger. The heir responds with confidence. He dictates replies that thank, acknowledge, defer. He assures the bank that matters are in order, that fluctuations are temporary, that the family's position remains sound. He believes these statements sincerely. They align perfectly with the story he has been telling himself for years. The letters continue. Each one introduces a slightly different note: requests for clarification, reminders of terms, suggestions for consolidation. Still, nothing accusatory. Still, nothing dramatic. The heir notices the accumulation only vaguely. He places the letters together, unopened at times, assuming they will resolve themselves. Silence has always resolved things before. What changes is not the content, but the frequency. Where letters once arrived quarterly, they now arrive monthly. Where requests were once optional, they now feel implied. The heir senses a shift, but cannot name it. The tone remains courteous. The language remains deferential. And so he continues as before, convinced that if there were truly a problem, someone would say so plainly. Bankers rarely do. They communicate through nuance, through timing, phrasing, repetition. They expect their clients to recognize these signals. The heir, untrained in this language, interprets politeness as patience, patience as security. Behind the letters, numbers tighten. Lines of credit are reviewed more often. Conditions adjust subtly. Flexibility narrows. The heir experiences these changes not as limits, but as inconveniences. He assumes they are procedural, temporary, perhaps even arbitrary. He does not yet see them as warnings. When meetings are suggested, he delays politely. Schedules are full. Travel intervenes. There is always time later. The letters are placed aside with intention, waiting for a moment that feels appropriate. That moment never quite arrives. The banker's concern grows more structured. Documents are attached. Summaries become more detailed. The heir skims rather than reads. He focuses on reassuring phrases and ignores the rest. His replies remain confident, if increasingly vague. Confidence, however, does not satisfy arithmetic. Eventually, the letters stop softening the message. They remain polite, but they become specific. Dates are mentioned. Obligations are clarified. The heir senses something new in the language, a firmness that resists deflection. He reads more carefully now, discomfort sharpening his attention. The realization arrives slowly, then all at once. The letters are not invitations. They are records. They do not seek reassurance. They require response. The heir understands this belatedly, feeling a tightening in the chest that no amount of refinement can disguise. The quiet tone that once felt comforting now feels ominous. Courtesy has become formality. Familiarity has receded. The banker has stopped assuming. In this moment, the heir experiences something unfamiliar, being addressed not as a symbol, not as a name, but as an account. His history matters less than his balance. His pedigree less than his position. The letters reflect this shift precisely, without cruelty, without apology. They are simply accurate. The heir responds more urgently now. He seeks meetings. He offers explanations. He promises adjustments. But urgency, once absent too long, does not inspire confidence. The banker listens, nods, and refers again to the numbers. Numbers do not negotiate politely. The letters have done their work. They have transitioned the relationship from trust to scrutiny without spectacle. There is no public disgrace, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet understanding that the terms have changed. For the heir, this is the first unmistakable sign that the world is no longer adjusting around him. The silence that once absorbed error has begun to speak, and it speaks in measured sentences, on modest paper, informing him gently, irrevocably that reassurance is no longer sufficient, and that the comfort of deferral has reached its end. The estate does not vanish. It diminishes. At first, the change is imperceptible, an adjustment disguised as preference, a boundary redrawn so delicately it escapes notice, a field left fallow for a season, a wing closed for repairs, a gardener dismissed and not replaced. Each decision appears reasonable, even tasteful, when considered alone. Together, they begin to alter the shape of the land. The heir walks the grounds as he always has, noticing little. Paths remain swept, lawns remain trimmed. The house still commands its view. What has changed is scale, not presence. The estate feels intact because its center remains intact. Loss occurs at the edges, where attention rarely lingers. This is how estates shrink without spectacle. A parcel is leased rather than sold temporary, the heir tells himself. Another is sold privately to settle a matter quickly, quietly. No announcement follows. Boundaries adjust on paper while the landscape retains its familiar contours. The heir does not measure acreage, he measures comfort. Comfort remains. Horses still graze, trees still line the drive. From the windows most often used, nothing appears altered. The estate's core performs its function, to reassure. As long as the view remains convincing, the heir believes the whole remains secure. The accounts tell a different story. Revenue from the land declines as holdings contract. Maintenance costs remain stubbornly fixed. The estate, once self-supporting, becomes dependent on transfers from elsewhere. This dependency is subtle, easily masked by routine transactions and deferred decisions. The heir notices only when prompted. An advisor mentions efficiency. A steward suggests consolidation. The language remains gentle, technical, devoid of alarm. These suggestions feel administrative rather than existential. The heir agrees readily, relieved that the changes sound controlled. Control is the illusion. Every reduction makes the next easier. What was once unthinkable becomes negotiable. The estate transitions from inheritance to instrument something, to be adjusted, optimized, leveraged. The heir tells himself, this is modernity, not retreat. Yet something essential is being lost. Estates do not merely generate income, they impose discipline. Their scale demands planning, foresight, restraint. As the estate shrinks, so too does the resistance it offers to excess. There is less land to manage, fewer obligations to honor, fewer reminders that resources are finite. The estate grows quieter. Fewer workers move through the grounds. Fewer lights burn at night. Rooms remain closed longer. These changes register as calm rather than contraction. Silence feels refined. Space feels curated. The heir interprets absence as intention. Guests do not comment. Those who visit see only what is shown to them. Tours are shorter now, routes carefully chosen. Conversations focus on the house, not the acreage. The heir notices their ease and takes comfort in it. If others see nothing amiss, surely nothing significant has changed. But the land remembers. Boundaries, once enforced by hedges and stone, now exist only in deeds. Paths, once maintained, fade quietly back into grass. The estate's former extent survives in memory, and maps, more than in use. The heir walks less, travels more, spending time away from the edges where loss is most apparent. When questions arise, they are answered smoothly. The heir speaks of efficiency, of focusing resources, of aligning the estate with contemporary realities. These phrases satisfy listeners and reassure the speaker. They frame reduction as strategy, not necessity. Necessity remains unspoken. By the time the heir realizes the estate can no longer support its own image, the transformation is largely complete. What remains is impressive, but fragile, an estate preserved as symbol rather than system. It looks substantial because it has been curated to do so. The invisibility of the shrinkage is its triumph. There has been no crisis, no sale announced in the papers, no public admission of decline, only a series of sensible decisions that, taken together, have altered the estate's nature entirely. The heir stands on the terrace one evening, surveying what remains. The view is still beautiful. The house still commands it. Nothing appears wrong. And yet, something has narrowed. The estate no longer holds the future the way it once did. It cannot absorb error indefinitely. It cannot sustain the life built upon it without assistance. Its margins have thinned beyond visibility. The heir does not yet feel alarm. He feels only a faint unease, a sense that the land has grown smaller without his consent, that the ground beneath him has receded quietly while he was elsewhere. The estate has not disappeared. It has simply become less forgiving, and in that quiet reduction lies the proof that decline does not need drama to be decisive. It requires only time, discretion, and the willingness to mistake absence for intention. The house grows quieter before it grows smaller. At first, the silence is pleasant, almost luxurious. Fewer footsteps at dawn, fewer murmurs behind doors. The heir notices this with mild approval, mistaking quiet for refinement. He tells himself the household has become more efficient, more modern, less cluttered with unnecessary presence. The change feels intentional. A maid leaves to marry. A footman is dismissed after a minor error. A gardener is not replaced when his health fails. Each departure is explained cleanly, without discomfort. These decisions feel reasonable, even responsible. The heir congratulates himself on prudence. What he does not yet recognize is pattern. Servants are let go individually, never in groups. There is no announcement, no reckoning. Each dismissal is framed as an exception, a unique circumstance unrelated to the last. The heir avoids seeing them together, because together they would tell a story he is not prepared to hear. The remaining staff adapt quietly. They take on extra duties without complaint. They move more quickly, speak less, avoid attention. The house continues to function, reinforcing the illusion that nothing essential has changed. The heir interprets this resilience as proof that the reductions were justified. Efficiency, he believes, has improved. But servants are not simply labor, they are memory. They carry knowledge of routines, habits, histories. As they leave, that knowledge disperses. Small errors begin to appear: misplaced items, forgotten preferences, delays where none existed before. These irritations are minor, but cumulative. The heir responds by correcting surfaces rather than causes. He instructs the remaining staff to be more attentive, more precise, more discreet. He does not recognize that precision requires time, and time requires hands. The house begins to feel different. Meals arrive slightly later. Rooms take longer to prepare. Maintenance is deferred. Nothing collapses outright. The changes are too subtle to provoke alarm, but they accumulate, altering the atmosphere in ways the heir cannot quite name. He attributes this to mood. The staff notices more. They understand what the heir avoids, that dismissals are no longer strategic, but necessary. They sense the narrowing margins, the unspoken pressure. Loyalty shifts quietly into caution. The remaining servants become careful not only in their work, but in their expectations. The house no longer promises permanence. Where once service implied stability, now it implies uncertainty. The remaining staff begin to imagine departure, not because they wish to leave, but because they sense they may soon be asked to. The house feels less anchored, less secure. The heir remains insulated. He still lives comfortably. His routines are maintained. The staff ensures that his experience remains as unchanged as possible. This effort, however, costs them more energy than before. Fatigue creeps in. Mistakes become more frequent. The heir grows irritated. He does not connect his irritation to the reductions he approved. He sees only the decline in service, not the conditions that produced it. He corrects sharply now, forgetting that correction once required presence, not pressure. The hierarchy shifts subtly. Servants who once felt invisible now feel exposed. Their work is noticed only when it fails. The warmth that once characterized the household cools. Interactions become transactional. Politeness replaces familiarity. The house begins to lose its rhythm. What was once seamless now requires effort. What was once automatic now demands attention. The heir experiences this as inconvenience rather than warning. He tells himself that all households evolve, that change is natural, that he is simply adjusting to a new standard. But standards have not changed. Resources have. By the time the heir recognizes that the house no longer functions as it once did, too many departures have already occurred to reverse course easily. Rehiring feels excessive, even irresponsible. The reductions have set a new baseline, one that assumes continued contraction. The silence deepens. Rooms remain unused. Corridors echo faintly. The house still stands, still impresses, still performs when required. But between performances, it feels hollowed, as though something essential has been removed along with the servants. The heir senses this absence but avoids naming it. To acknowledge the loss of staff would be to acknowledge the loss of capacity, of margin, of safety. It would mean admitting that the house, once self-sustaining, now struggles quietly to maintain itself. And so the servants continue to leave, one by one, each departure small enough to ignore, together forming a change too large to undo. The house does not complain. It simply becomes less forgiving. And the heir, surrounded by quiet, begins to realize too late that comfort was never produced by walls alone, but by the people who moved within them, correcting what he never saw, absorbing what he never felt, and leaving now because there is no longer enough room for them to stay. The sale is framed as discretion. It is not discussed openly, not announced at table, not recorded in the social columns. A property changes hands without ceremony, handled by intermediaries who understand the value of silence. The heir does not say sold. He says released, transferred, reassigned. Language is chosen to preserve dignity rather than accuracy. No one asks why. In the Gilded Age, to inquire directly is impolite. Motives are assumed, never interrogated. The heir relies on this etiquette, trusting that silence will protect him from scrutiny. The property, after all, was secondary, a townhouse used infrequently, a parcel inherited but never loved, a place whose absence can be explained as preference. The explanation, when offered at all, is aesthetic. He speaks of focus, of simplification, of taste evolving. He suggests that managing fewer properties allows for greater enjoyment of what remains. The logic is agreeable. It sounds modern, even wise. Listeners nod, relieved not to confront anything uncomfortable. This relief becomes complicity. By not asking why, society permits the illusion to persist. Everyone benefits from the pretense that nothing is wrong. The heir is spared embarrassment. Observers are spared anxiety. The transaction dissolves into normalcy. The mechanics are efficient. Agents handle viewings quietly. Buyers are vetted for discretion. Contracts are signed quickly, often below the value the heir remembers, but within a range that feels defensible. The heir accepts the terms without negotiation, grateful for the speed. Speed feels like control. The proceeds are absorbed immediately. They settle accounts, restore liquidity, smooth recent disruptions. For a brief moment, the pressure eases. The heir breathes more freely, interpreting the relief as confirmation that the decision was correct. The sale has solved a problem without producing visible damage. This success is instructive. It teaches the heir that property can be exchanged for time without consequence. That reduction can occur invisibly, that one can live smaller without appearing diminished. The lesson is comforting and therefore dangerous. Selling property without saying why reshapes the estate quietly. The geography of the heir's life contracts. Fewer destinations require attention. Fewer responsibilities demand oversight. The heir interprets this contraction as liberation. He tells himself that less is more, that focus enhances quality. Yet something essential has been traded. Properties are not merely assets, they are commitments. They anchor routine, impose structure, require planning. As they disappear, the heir's life becomes more fluid, less constrained by obligation. This fluidity feels pleasant until it removes the last barriers to excess. The pattern repeats. Another property is deemed redundant. Another sale is arranged discreetly. The explanations remain consistent, polished, unchallenged. Each transaction reinforces the narrative of choice rather than necessity. The heir becomes adept at not saying why. The absence of explanation becomes habit. When friends notice the changes, they attribute them to strategy. When family wonders privately, they choose not to ask. Everyone prefers the version of events that requires the least adjustment. Behind the scenes, the estate's capacity erodes. Income streams narrow, maintenance economies become permanent. The margin for error thins further. The heir, however, experiences only the immediate benefit, the easing of pressure, the restoration of balance, the continuation of life as it has been. This continuation masks the cost. Each sale reduces the future's flexibility. Options are consumed to preserve the present. The heir does not feel this trade-off because the present remains comfortable. He measures success by continuity, not by resilience. Eventually, the language begins to strain. There are fewer secondary properties left to explain away. Each remaining holding is more central, more visible, harder to relinquish without comment. The heir senses this narrowing instinctively, feeling a faint urgency he cannot articulate. He responds by selling more quickly. Speed replaces deliberation. Discretion replaces justification. The heir becomes practiced at removing pieces from his life without allowing them to leave a trace. The art lies in maintaining the surface while hollowing the structure beneath it. Selling property without saying why works until it doesn't. When there is nothing left that can be sold quietly, when every remaining asset is too visible to vanish without explanation, the heir will face a choice he has postponed for years: to speak plainly or to endure scrutiny. For now, however, the strategy holds. The heir continues to move through rooms that remain impressive, hosting conversations that remain polite, sustaining a life that still resembles what it has always been. Only the map has changed. The spaces that once supported this life have been folded away, one by one, without comment, leaving the heir, standing confidently at the center of a world that has grown smaller than he knows, sustained by silence, and increasingly unable to carry him forward much longer. When the body begins to protest, it does so politely at first. A tremor in the hands that appears only when pouring, a tightening behind the eyes late in the afternoon, sleep that arrives reluctantly and leaves too early. The heir notices these changes with mild curiosity, attributing them to travel, to age, to the ordinary pressures of a life well lived. He does not yet call them symptoms. In the Gilded Age, discomfort of the nerves is not alarming, it is fashionable. Physicians speak of strain, of overexertion, of the toll taken by modern life. The language is flattering. To suffer from nerves is to signal sensitivity, refinement, a constitution too delicate for vulgar endurance. And so the heir consults a doctor. The visit is unhurried. The room smells faintly of antiseptic and something sweeter. The physician listens attentively, nodding at intervals, asking questions that circle the problem without approaching its center. Stress is mentioned. Rest is prescribed. A tonic is suggested not as cure, but as support. The tonic is delivered discreetly. It arrives in amber glass, measured carefully, accompanied by instructions that emphasize moderation. The heir takes it faithfully. It dulls the edge of unease, smooths the day's transitions. The effect is subtle but reassuring. The symptoms recede just enough to be forgotten. This feels like resolution. The heir does not ask what produced the strain in the first place. He is not encouraged to. The physician treats the nerves as an isolated phenomenon, unrelated to circumstance. Chemical balance replaces context. Relief becomes the goal. As pressures increase elsewhere, the tonics multiply. Another doctor recommends something stronger for sleep. A colleague suggests a stimulant for mornings dulled by worry. Each prescription is framed as temporary, corrective, safe when used properly. The heir trusts the expertise. He has always trusted systems designed to absorb discomfort. The body becomes another surface to manage. Just as finances were adjusted without confrontation, nerves are treated without examination. The heir learns to interpret anxiety as a condition to be medicated rather than a message to be heard. When unease surfaces, he reaches not for understanding, but for relief. This approach works briefly. The tonics restore composure. Sleep improves. Appetite returns. The heir resumes his routines with renewed confidence, convinced that the problem has been addressed. He does not notice that the underlying pressures remain unchanged, quietly intensifying. Doctors rarely speak of cause. They treat symptoms, adjust dosages, monitor reactions. Their interest lies in stability, not transformation. The heir appreciates this focus. Transformation would require change. Stability allows continuity. Nerves become normalized. The air discusses them casually with peers, many of whom share similar prescriptions, similar routines. Everyone speaks of fatigue, of strain, of the modern world's demands. There is comfort in this shared experience. If everyone is tired, no one needs to ask why. But the body keeps its own accounts. Tolerance develops, the tonics lose their edge, dosages increase slightly, then again. Relief becomes shorter-lived. The air grows restless, irritable, distracted. He attributes this to the same fashionable ailments: nerves, pressure, responsibility. Responsibility remains unexamined. When moments of clarity threaten late at night, in the early hours before sleep, the air reaches instinctively for the medicine that quiets thought. Silence returns. Questions recede. Morning arrives with its familiar routines intact. This pattern becomes habit. The air does not see the connection between his nerves and the letters, the sales, the quiet reductions. He experiences them as separate spheres: body and estate, health and finance, each managed independently by experts. The separation is comforting. It allows him to continue without synthesis, without reckoning. The body is treated, the estate is adjusted, the life remains intact on the surface. But the nerves know what the air avoids. They respond to pressure even when language does not. They signal imbalance when accounts are ignored. Each tremor, each sleepless night, each moment of inexplicable dread carries information the air refuses to decode. Doctors and tonics offer reprieve, not resolution. They postpone the moment when the air must acknowledge that his life has become unsustainable, not just financially, but internally. The body has begun to register what the mind has been trained to deflect. The air senses this dimly, through the haze of medication and reassurance. He tells himself that everyone lives this way now, that nerves are the price of refinement, that modern life demands chemical assistance. Perhaps this is true. But beneath the tonics and the careful language, beneath the polite consultations and the measured doses, the pressure continues to build quietly, persistently waiting for a moment when it can no longer be softened into silence. Appearances harden when resources thin. What was once effortless becomes deliberate. What once flowed naturally now requires planning, rehearsal, correction. The air notices this shift only indirectly, through fatigue rather than fear. Maintaining the surface of his life begins to consume more energy than living it. But the surface must hold. In the Gilded Age, appearance is not decoration, it is evidence. A well-kept exterior reassures others that the interior remains sound. Polished shoes imply stability. Full tables imply solvency. Calm manners imply control. To allow any one of these to falter is to invite speculation. Speculation is dangerous. The air learns to watch himself carefully. Clothing is chosen not for comfort, but for consistency. Invitations are accepted or declined strategically, based on visibility rather than desire. Public moments are curated. Private discomfort is contained. Nothing must appear strained. The irony is that effort increases precisely as effort must be concealed. The air works harder to look relaxed than he ever did to be secure. Ease becomes performance. Composure becomes labor. Each day requires vigilance to ensure that nothing slips: a delayed payment, a reduced staff, a quieter house. Language is refined further. He speaks of changes as choices. He reframes reductions as preferences. He emphasizes quality over quantity, focus over scale. These phrases are repeated often enough to feel true. Others accept them readily, grateful not to confront what they might otherwise be forced to notice. Courtesy sustains the illusion. Friends do not ask direct questions. Acquaintances do not press. Society participates willingly in the fiction that everything remains exactly as it should. Politeness becomes a collective agreement to look away. This agreement has a cost. The air must remain constantly visible enough to reassure, but never exposed enough to invite scrutiny. He hosts selectively, appears strategically, withdraws carefully. Every movement is calculated to preserve relevance, without provoking curiosity. The margins narrow. Small missteps feel catastrophic. A cancelled event requires explanation. A missed engagement invites rumor. The heir becomes hyper-aware of how his life is read by others, monitoring reactions for signs of doubt. He interprets tone, posture, timing, anything that might indicate that the illusion is weakening. This vigilance is exhausting. Sleep becomes shallow. Conversations feel scripted. Pleasure drains from activities once enjoyed. The heir continues because stopping would feel like surrender. As long as the appearance holds, he believes he can still recover. Recovery becomes hypothetical. Resources are now devoted primarily to preservation rather than growth. Money is spent to sustain the image of abundance rather than to rebuild substance. The house remains impressive, but fragile. The lifestyle remains intact, but brittle. Maintaining appearances accelerates depletion. Every dinner, hosted to demonstrate stability, consumes resources needed for actual stability. Every journey taken to signal ease drains funds that might have eased pressure elsewhere. The heir understands this abstractly but cannot act on it. To reduce appearances would be to acknowledge decline publicly. Public acknowledgement feels fatal. The heir tells himself that once matters improve, he will relax. Once the pressure eases, he will simplify. Once the accounts stabilize, he will step back. These promises defer action indefinitely. Appearances must be maintained until something changes, yet nothing can change while appearances consume everything. The performance intensifies. As doubts flicker at the edges, the heir responds with greater precision. He sharpens his presentation. He invests more in the visible markers of success. He speaks confidently, laughs easily, gestures generously. He becomes, in effect, a curator of his own life. Behind the scenes, support structures weaken. Staff numbers thin further. Maintenance is delayed. Advisors grow cautious. The heir senses these changes but addresses them cosmetically. He corrects symptoms, not causes. The appearance remains convincing, just. This is the cruel balance. The better the heir becomes at maintaining appearances, the longer collapse is delayed, and the more severe it will be when it arrives. By preserving the surface, he prevents intervention. By looking stable, he ensures that no one insists on change. Maintaining appearances at any cost feels like survival. In truth, it is preservation of form over function, of image over resilience. It trades the possibility of recovery for the certainty of delay. The heir continues not because it works, but because it is the only thing he knows how to do. When appearances finally fail, they will fail suddenly. There will be no gradual dimming, no polite transition. The surface will crack under the accumulated weight of its own maintenance. And the heir, having spent everything to keep it intact, will find that nothing remains beneath it strong enough to hold. Until that moment, he smiles, hosts, reassures, and performs convinced that as long as the world still sees him as he was, he might yet avoid becoming what he is rapidly turning into. The children do not know they are being instructed. They move through rooms that still look complete, through routines that still function well enough to deceive. Meals arrive, clothing is pressed, voices remain calm. The house performs its role convincingly, and so the children assume that what they see is what is. This is the lie, carefully maintained. They grow up believing that stability is inherent, that comfort requires no explanation. Just as the heir once did, they inherit an atmosphere rather than an understanding. The illusion is passed down not through words but through consistency. As long as nothing appears wrong, nothing is wrong. Parents become curators. Conversations are filtered. Worries are softened into abstractions. Words like temporary, adjustment, and preference circulate freely. The children hear these phrases without context, absorbing their tone rather than their meaning. They learn that questions about money are impolite, unnecessary, vaguely embarrassing. The lie is not malicious. It is protective, born of the belief that children should be spared anxiety. Parents tell themselves there will be time later, time to explain, time to prepare, time to correct. For now, the children should feel safe. For now, the house must hold. But time is already narrowing. The children notice small inconsistencies first. A favorite room remains closed, a familiar servant disappears. A summer trip is postponed without explanation. These changes are addressed gently, framed as coincidence or choice. The children accept the explanations because they have no reason not to. Trust is their inheritance. They believe what they are told because they believe their parents. And their parents, desperate to maintain calm, believe their own reassurances as well. The lie becomes shared, reinforced by repetition and routine. Education follows the same pattern. Schools remain appropriate, tutors remain attentive. The outward markers of privilege persist just long enough to sustain expectation. The children are taught manners, languages, posture, but not contingency. They are trained to assume continuity, just as their parents once were. This assumption is fragile. The children begin to internalize a sense of entitlement that no longer corresponds to reality. They expect a future modeled on a past that has already begun to dissolve. Their ambitions, such as they are, align with a life that cannot be supported indefinitely. Parents sense this disconnect dimly. They worry in private, late at night, when the house is quiet and the performance pauses. They wonder whether they should say something, whether they should begin preparing the children for change. But preparation would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would fracture the calm they have worked so hard to preserve. So they wait. They tell themselves that children adapt easily, that explanations can come later, that nothing is yet irreversible. They choose silence over disruption, believing that withholding truth is an act of care. In doing so, they repeat the original error. The children grow accustomed to a standard that cannot be maintained. They learn to desire what will soon be unavailable. They practice a way of life that depends on resources already stretched thin. When they speak of the future, they speak confidently, college, travel, estates, echoing assumptions that no longer hold. The parents listen, smiling carefully. Each confident statement feels like both reassurance and indictment. The lie must now be maintained not only for society, but for the children themselves. To correct them would be to confess failure. To remain silent is to ensure shock later. Shock feels distant for now. The children remain protected, insulated by routine and tone. They do not see the letters. They do not hear the late-night conversations. They do not notice the calculations performed quietly before decisions are made. The lie works precisely because it is thorough. But lies age poorly. As the children grow older, their questions sharpen. They notice more. They compare. They sense tension in pauses, in deflections, in the careful way their parents answer certain inquiries. The illusion begins to strain under the weight of curiosity. Parents respond with reassurance. They insist that everything is fine, that change is normal, that adaptation is healthy. These statements are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. They lack the crucial element of honesty that allows adaptation to occur. When the truth finally arrives, it will not arrive gently. It will come as contrast between what was promised implicitly and what is suddenly available. The children will feel disoriented, not merely by loss, but by revelation. They will realize that the world they were trained for no longer exists. They will also realize something more unsettling, that the adults they trusted most participated in the fiction. The children raised inside the lie are not weaker than their parents. They are simply unprepared. And unpreparedness, once inherited, does not dissolve easily. It echoes forward, shaping expectations, decisions, and disappointments, long after the house has fallen quiet and the performance has ended. The lie was meant to protect them. Instead, it ensures that when reality asserts itself, as it always does, it will do so without warning, without context, and without mercy. And the children, standing amid the remnants of a life they were promised but never taught to sustain, will be forced to begin where their parents never did, not with comfort, but with truth. When money grows reluctant, reputation is asked to compensate. The heir does not think of it as borrowing at first. He thinks of it as recognition of goodwill accumulated over years, of trust earned by name rather than balance. The requests are phrased carefully, offered with humility just convincing enough to feel sincere. He does not ask for rescue. He asks for consideration. Reputation has always opened doors. It has smoothed transactions, softened terms, delayed consequences. It has substituted for explanation, and often for proof. The heir has lived his entire life within its protective radius. To draw upon it now feels natural, even earned. After all, reputation has weight precisely because it is meant to be relied upon. The first loan is extended quietly. No collateral is demanded beyond assurance. No scrutiny is applied beyond familiarity. The lender smiles, speaks warmly, recalls shared dinners, shared acquaintances, shared histories. The sum is modest, framed as temporary assistance, a bridge over a brief inconvenience. The heir feels relief, not shame. The loan does not feel like failure. It feels like confirmation that the world still responds, that confidence remains justified. He leaves the meeting lighter, reassured that his standing continues to matter more than his numbers. This relief is intoxicating. It teaches the heir that reputation can still correct imbalance, that trust can replace liquidity, that the system bends, as it always has, when approached properly. The loan is absorbed quickly, disappearing into the familiar machinery of maintenance. The problem, temporarily, recedes. But loans taken against reputation differ from those taken against assets. They are personal. They carry memory. They are repaid not only with money but with expectation. The heir understands this abstractly but not urgently. He tells himself, the loan will be settled soon, once conditions improve. Conditions do not improve. Pressure returns, quieter but more insistent. The heir hesitates before asking again, sensing that repetition might change the tone. He waits, adjusts, reassures himself that one more solution will emerge. When it does not, he approaches another lender, someone equally familiar, equally invested in the myth of continuity. The second loan is smaller, more cautious. Terms are discussed more clearly. Timelines are mentioned. The heir nods, agrees readily. He leaves again with relief tinged faintly by discomfort. The transaction feels different this time, less celebratory, more procedural. Still, it works. The pattern establishes itself. Loans are taken selectively, from those who share history, who understand the family name, who trust the heir's intentions even when they doubt his margins. Each loan feels justified by circumstance. Each is framed as temporary. Each allows the heir to postpone reduction a little longer. Reputation begins to thin. It does not fracture suddenly. It frays. Lenders speak less warmly. Meetings become shorter. Familiarity gives way to formality. The heir notices these changes but attributes them to caution rather than concern. Concern, however, is present. Those who lend now do so with reservation. They calculate not just risk, but exposure. Reputation, once abundant, is now finite. Each loan consumes a portion of it, converting trust into obligation. The heir begins to feel watched. Not openly, but attentively. Questions are asked more directly. Updates are requested. The heir responds diligently, offering reassurances that sound increasingly rehearsed. He senses that the language of courtesy is tightening, losing its elasticity. Loans taken against reputation demand repayment in confidence. When repayment delays, confidence erodes. The heir experiences this erosion as tension in conversations, as hesitation in responses, as warmth cooling imperceptibly. He grows anxious not about the money itself, but about what the money now represents. He is no longer merely a borrower. He is a test. Others watch how he handles these obligations, drawing conclusions that extend beyond their own involvement. Reputation, once singular and unified, now fragments into assessments held privately by different parties. The heir cannot see these assessments. He feels only the narrowing of options. Fewer doors open easily. Requests require explanation. The ease that once defined his interactions has vanished. He compensates by leaning harder on the reputation that remains, accelerating its depletion. This acceleration is dangerous. Loans taken against reputation cannot be rolled indefinitely. They demand resolution, either repayment or reckoning. The heir, having exhausted assets quietly and sold property discreetly, now finds himself exposed. For the first time, reputation does not function as shield. It becomes liability. Each unpaid loan carries not just interest, but narrative. Stories begin to circulate, quietly, politely, among those who matter. Nothing defamatory, nothing explicit. Just a shift in tone, a change in expectation. The heir senses the shift, but cannot arrest it. He has borrowed not just money, but time, trust, and patience. All are running out together. When reputation finally refuses to compensate for scarcity, it will not announce itself with drama. It will simply stop responding. And when that happens, the heir will discover that reputation, once converted into credit, cannot be reclaimed easily, especially when there is nothing left to repay it with but explanations. And explanations no longer suffice. The illusion announces itself gently. It arrives not as triumph, but as relief numbers that look marginally better, a letter that sounds less firm, a conversation that ends with reassurance rather than concern. The heir receives these signals with a hunger he does not recognize as such. He tells himself that prudence has finally taken hold, that the worst has passed, that the system is correcting itself at last. He wants this to be true. A small influx appears, proceeds from a delayed payment, a temporary uptick, a favorable adjustment negotiated quietly. It is not enough to restore what has been lost, but it is enough to change the mood. The pressure eases. The heir feels lighter. The heir allows himself to believe that this is the beginning of recovery rather than the pause before exposure. Language shifts immediately. He speaks of turning corners and steadying the course. He refers to recent improvements and encouraging signs. These phrases circulate quickly, soothing those who wish to be soothed. Advisors nod carefully. Friends smile with relief. No one challenges the optimism. Optimism, after all, costs nothing. The heir reads meaning into coincidence. A bill is paid on time and becomes evidence of discipline. A creditor agrees to wait and becomes proof of renewed confidence. A reduction in expenses is interpreted not as contraction, but as strategy bearing fruit. The heir begins to see patterns where there are only moments. This is the illusion's strength. It organizes scattered positives into a narrative of ascent. It suggests momentum without requiring substance. It allows the heir to believe that he has reached the low point and begun to rise, even though nothing fundamental has changed. The habits remain. Spending resumes cautiously, then more freely. The heir loosens restrictions he had imposed reluctantly, convinced that restraint has done its work. Appearances are restored incrementally. A dinner hosted, a trip reconsidered. Each decision feels earned, justified by the belief that balance has returned. Balance has not returned. What has returned is confidence, the most expensive commodity of all. It dissolves caution. It reframes risk as opportunity. It whispers that the lesson has been learned, that the system will now respond as it once did. The heir confuses timing with cause. He assumes that improvement follows action, when in truth it follows delay. Temporary relief is mistaken for correction. The margin that reappears briefly is treated as proof of resilience, rather than the final elasticity of a structure long overstressed. Those who know better remain silent. Advisors choose careful words. They do not wish to extinguish hope. Creditors accept partial assurances. They, too, prefer the idea of recovery. Everyone participates in the illusion, because confronting its fragility would require choices no one wishes to make. The illusion becomes communal. It spreads through conversations, letters, glances. The heir is congratulated subtly, politely, on his steadiness. This praise reinforces the belief that he has navigated the danger successfully. He absorbs it gratefully, mistaking affirmation for accuracy. But the numbers do not align. Behind the encouraging signs, obligations continue to accumulate. Deferred costs reassert themselves. Income remains insufficient. The structure, briefly unburdened, is still unsound. The heir does not look closely enough to see this. He has already decided what the signs mean. The illusion discourages further reduction. Why sell more when recovery has begun? Why retreat when progress appears imminent? The heir delays the hard choices once again, convinced that restraint now would be premature, even pessimistic. He chooses continuity, trusting that momentum will carry him forward. Momentum carries him only until it stops. The next setback feels disproportionate. A payment missed? A refusal issued? A letter that tightens its language again? The heir is stunned, not because the setback is severe, but because it contradicts the story he has embraced. The illusion collapses quietly. It does not shatter. It thins, losing coherence as contradictions accumulate. The heir resists this at first, insisting that setbacks are temporary, that progress is rarely linear. These statements are true in general and misleading in this case. What has been mistaken for recovery is merely reprieve. The illusion of a turnaround delays acceptance at the moment. Acceptance could still have guided action. It restores confidence just long enough to ensure that confidence will soon be punished. When the illusion finally dissolves, it leaves behind something worse than despair. It leaves disbelief. The heir stands amid the remnants of hope he has already spent, realizing that the signs he trusted were never evidence of strength, only proof that collapse, like everything else in his life, preferred to arrive politely, offering comfort until the very last moment it could no longer be sustained. There comes a moment when numbers stop pretending. They no longer soften themselves through language or timing. They no longer arrive with reassurance or delay. They stand plainly on the page, reduced, rigid, unyielding. The heir looks at them longer now, not because he wishes to, but because there is nothing else left to look at. The fortune has not vanished. It has receded into recollection. What remains is difficult to recognize as wealth at all. There are still assets, still accounts, still property, but none of it behaves as the fortune once did. It no longer absorbs error. It no longer cushions misjudgment. It no longer corrects imbalance quietly. Each decision now leaves a mark. The heir feels this change viscerally. Expenditures provoke anxiety. Choices require calculation. The ease that once defined his life has been replaced by vigilance. He moves carefully, aware that even small missteps now carry weight. This awareness feels foreign, almost humiliating, not because caution is wrong, but because it arrives so late. Memory becomes refuge. The heir recalls years when money moved freely, when decisions were made without consequence, when comfort arrived automatically. These memories grow sharper as the present grows narrower. He compares constantly today against then, measuring loss not in currency, but in sensation. The past feels expansive. The present feels brittle. Friends speak of former times with affectionate nostalgia, unaware of how precisely those recollections wound. They reference houses no longer owned, trips no longer possible, habits no longer affordable. The heir smiles politely, participating in the ritual of remembrance while quietly counting what remains. Memory replaces planning. Rather than imagining a future built on present conditions, the heir orients himself backward. He draws confidence from what once was, even though it no longer exists. The fortune, now mostly memory, continues to influence behavior long after its substance has dissolved. This delay is costly. He hesitates to adjust fully because adjustment would require admitting that the past cannot be recovered. Reduction feels final, irreversible. As long as memory dominates perception, the heir believes somewhere that restoration remains possible. But restoration requires resources. The remaining assets are fragmented, constrained by obligations incurred earlier. Liquidity is scarce. Options are limited. The heir recognizes this intellectually, but emotionally he remains anchored to an earlier version of himself, one who did not need to think this way. The house reflects this tension. It still contains reminders, portraits, furnishings, objects that speak of endurance. These items comfort and accuse simultaneously. They suggest continuity while underscoring absence. The heir moves among them carefully, aware that they belong more fully to memory than to the future. Conversations change. Those who remain close speak cautiously, measuring words. Topics narrow. There is less talk of expansion, more of maintenance. The heir notices the shift but does not comment. Commenting would require acknowledgement. The fortune's role has inverted. Once, it structured the future. Now, it structures the past. It explains who the heir was, not who he will be. It provides context, not capacity. The heir finds this inversion disorienting. Identity, long supported by abundance, now floats uncertainly without it. This is the quietest stage of decline. There is no spectacle, no public reckoning, only a gradual realization that the life being lived is no longer aligned with the resources supporting it. The heir senses that something must give, but not yet which part. He continues to live carefully, cautiously, almost respectfully, as though the fortune might respond to restraint with renewal. This hope is not entirely irrational. Some fortunes do recover. Some structures endure. But this one has been spent preserving appearances rather than rebuilding substance. Memory cannot perform the work that money once did. It cannot settle obligations. It cannot sustain households. It cannot secure futures. It can only comfort, briefly, before reminding the heir of what is no longer possible. The realization settles slowly. The fortune that once defined his life now defines only its beginning. Everything that followed has been an attempt to prolong that beginning indefinitely. That attempt has failed not through catastrophe, but through exhaustion. The heir does not yet speak this truth aloud. He holds it quietly, feeling its weight without naming it. He still occupies the remnants of a life built for abundance, navigating them carefully, respectfully, as one might walk through a house already half emptied. The fortune is not gone, but it no longer belongs to the present. It lives in stories, in comparisons, in the way the heir still thinks about money as something that will eventually return to its former behavior. And until he releases that belief, the future remains suspended, waiting for him to stop living off memory and begin living within what actually remains. The realization does not arrive loudly. There is no confrontation, no sharp refusal spoken across a desk. Instead, it comes through a pause, a fraction too long to ignore, a glance exchanged, a sentence that begins warmly and ends carefully. The heir feels it first as temperature rather than meaning, the room cooling in a way that cannot be blamed on weather. He says his name. It lands differently. Once, the name operated ahead of him, clearing space, inviting trust, easing transitions. It arrived with weight already attached, a credential that required no elaboration. Now it is received politely, acknowledged precisely, and set aside. The heir senses this shift with a tightening in the chest he has learned to recognize. The name is heard. It is no longer acted upon. In conversation, he notices the absence of follow-up. There is no immediate offer, no instinctive accommodation. He is asked questions that once would have been unnecessary. Details are requested. Context is required. The name, stripped of its former authority, must now submit to explanation. This feels like a misunderstanding. The heir assumes there has been an oversight, that familiarity has simply lapsed. He repeats the name, gently, as one might reintroduce a fact believed to be known. The response is courteous, unchanged. The distance remains. Courtesy replaces deference. The heir leaves these interactions unsettled, replaying them privately. He wonders whether he spoke too softly, whether time has altered perception. He does not yet consider the possibility that the name itself has changed, that its meaning has thinned through use, erosion, and quiet doubt. The world has been keeping accounts. Reputation, once expansive, has been drawn down by loans, reassurances, delays. It has absorbed uncertainty without replenishment. The name still exists, but it no longer guarantees outcome. It has become descriptive rather than operative. The heir tests it again. In another setting, with another acquaintance, he mentions lineage, association, shared history. The response is respectful but procedural. Promises are replaced with possibilities, warmth with neutrality. The heir recognizes the pattern now, though he resists its conclusion. The name no longer accelerates trust. This realization carries a peculiar grief. Loss of money is measurable, loss of property is visible, loss of name is abstract, yet profound. It touches identity itself. The heir has always moved through the world under the assumption that his name preceded him, that it announced reliability, continuity, solidity. Now it introduces uncertainty. He notices this shift most acutely in silence. Calls are returned later. Invitations arrive less frequently. Suggestions are replaced by waiting. Nothing overt, nothing cruel, just a subtle recalibration of attention. The heir is no longer anticipated. He is responded to. The difference is everything. He adapts instinctively, offering more explanation, more assurance, more presence. He leans into the name harder, invoking it where once it would have been unnecessary. This only accelerates the change. What must be insisted upon has already lost its power. The heir grows careful. He begins to choose when to say the name aloud and when to let it remain implied. He becomes strategic about its use, rationing it as one might a dwindling resource. This awareness, once unthinkable, becomes routine. The name becomes fragile. It can still open doors, but only narrowly. It can still persuade, but only briefly. It no longer absorbs contradiction. It no longer protects against scrutiny. The heir understands now that reputation is not fixed. It is dynamic, responsive, and unforgiving when neglected. The day the name stops working is not marked by collapse. It is marked by adjustment, others adjusting their expectations, their terms, their tone. The heir adjusts too, though more slowly. He must recalibrate not just his strategy but his sense of self. Without the name's automatic authority, he is exposed. He must negotiate, he must justify, he must wait. These experiences feel foreign, even degrading, not because they are unjust, but because he has lived without them for so long. The world he once navigated effortlessly now demands participation. The heir feels smaller. not diminished exactly, but contained, bound by conditions he once bypassed. The realization settles that whatever remains of the fortune, whatever fragments of influence persist, they will no longer be amplified by inheritance alone. The name has become historical. It refers backward rather than forward. It evokes what was rather than what will be. The heir senses this shift deeply, feeling the weight of expectation dissolve into memory. He leaves one such meeting and pauses on the street longer than necessary, watching others pass. No one recognizes him. No one adjusts their pace. The anonymity is complete and strangely clarifying. For the first time, the heir understands that what he has been protecting all these years, the image, the continuity, the surface, has finally detached from function. The name still exists, but it no longer works. And in that quiet failure lies a truth more difficult than bankruptcy, that inheritance, once spent, cannot be summoned by memory alone, and that identity built upon it must now learn to stand without its echo. The idea of reduction arrives as reason, not defeat. It presents itself calmly, almost politely, after all other arguments have exhausted themselves. The heir does not wake one morning resolved to live smaller. He simply reaches a point where the calculations permit no other interpretation. What remains can support this life, or it can collapse, attempting to sustain the old one. For the first time, the choice is explicit. The smaller life is not unfamiliar. It has hovered at the edges for years, suggested by advisors, implied by numbers, hinted at by the quiet narrowing of options. The heir has resisted it instinctively, not because it was unbearable, but because it felt premature. Reduction was always framed as something to consider later, once the situation clarified. Now it has clarified. The decision is made without ceremony. There is no declaration, no announcement. Adjustments simply begin to occur without apology. Certain rooms are closed permanently. Travel becomes rare. Entertaining is reduced to obligation rather than habit. The heir speaks of these changes plainly, no longer dressing them in language of preference. Plainness feels strange. It lacks the protective sheen of refinement. It exposes the truth too directly. Yet there is also relief in it, a loosening of effort, a release from constant performance. For the first time in years, the heir is not trying to convince anyone of anything. The relief is tempered by regret. The smaller life, had it been chosen earlier, might have preserved more than it now can. Reduction, when voluntary, carries dignity. When delayed, it carries consequence. The heir understands this distinction acutely. Each adjustment feels heavier because it arrives after necessity, not foresight. The house responds immediately. Without the pressure of performance, it grows quieter in a different way. The silence is no longer staged. It is functional. The heir moves through the space with fewer obligations, fewer interruptions. He notices details once overlooked: the wear in the floorboards, the faded upholstery, the way light settles differently in unused rooms. These observations do not wound, they ground. The smaller life demands attention rather than maintenance. It replaces spectacle with routine. The heir begins to perform tasks once delegated, small acts of care, simple decisions, modest economies. These actions feel unfamiliar, even awkward, but not intolerable. What is intolerable is the timing. The heir cannot escape the knowledge that this life would have worked before comfortably, even generously, had it been chosen when resources still allowed flexibility. Now it is not a strategy, but a settlement. It does not preserve potential. It acknowledges its absence. Social life contracts naturally. There are fewer invitations, fewer appearances. The heir no longer compensates for absence with explanation. Those who remain adjust quickly. Relationships recalibrate around the new scale. Some fade without conflict. Others grow unexpectedly honest. This honesty is unsettling. Without the need to maintain appearances, conversations drift closer to reality. People speak more directly. The heir is addressed as himself rather than as symbol. This shift would have been valuable earlier. Now it feels like an education received too late to apply broadly. The smaller life exposes what mattered. Without abundance to distract, preferences sharpen. The heir discovers which comforts were essential and which merely habitual. Some losses sting less than expected. Others linger, not because they were extravagant, but because they represented possibility. Possibility is the quiet casualty. The smaller life does not include room for error. It does not tolerate indulgence easily. It demands consistency, restraint, presence. The heir adapts slowly, imperfectly, learning to measure not against memory but against capacity. This adjustment is humbling. Yet, it is also stabilizing. For the first time in years, the numbers align with behavior. There is coherence between means and life. The pressure that once expressed itself through nerves and vigilance subsides into something manageable. The cost of this coherence is finality. The heir understands now that the path back to what was is closed not by misfortune but by time. The opportunity to choose reduction as strategy has passed. What remains is acceptance, and the discipline to live within it. Acceptance does not erase grief. There are moments unexpected, sharp, when memory intrudes, a habit half-formed, a room unconsciously entered, a phrase begun and abandoned. These moments remind the heir that identity lingers longer than circumstance. But identity adapts. Slowly, quietly, the heir begins to inhabit the smaller life, fully not as punishment, but as reality. He stops imagining explanations he will never give. He releases the need to be understood as he once was. The smaller life, chosen too late, is still a life. It lacks the ease of the past, but it offers something the larger life no longer could: honesty without performance, stability without illusion, and the possibility, however modest, of standing without pretending to be more than what remains. If the heir had chosen it sooner, it might have preserved a future. Chosen now, it preserves something else entirely. It preserves him. Old friendships do not break. They recalibrate. The heir notices this not in absence, but in adjustment in the way voices lower, in how sentences are constructed with more care than before. Familiarity remains, but it is tempered, wrapped now in caution rather than ease. Old friends still call him by name, still recall shared moments, still smile with genuine warmth. What has changed is what they do not say. Conversation becomes selective. Topics once spoken freely now pass unmentioned. Plans are referenced vaguely. Invitations arrive with qualifiers. Old friends, who once spoke without calculation, now seem to weigh each word before releasing it. The heir senses this restraint and interprets it at first as politeness, even kindness. He later understands it as distance. These friends know more than they say. They have noticed the changes, the quieter house, the reduced staff, the smaller life now lived without performance. They have heard things, though nothing explicit. They do not wish to embarrass him by acknowledging what everyone now quietly understands. Care becomes the new language of loyalty. They ask about health rather than ventures, about comfort rather than plans. Their concern is genuine, but its focus reveals the shift. They no longer assume expansion, they assume endurance. This assumption, though kindly meant, unsettles the heir deeply. He had once been their equal, not just socially but symbolically. His presence reinforced their own sense of continuity, of shared belonging to a world that functioned predictably. Now, his decline never spoken of, never named, casts a shadow over their interactions. They are careful not to look directly at it. In gatherings, the heir notices how conversations move around him. Subjects are chosen that require no contribution, no disclosure. He is included, but not engaged. His friends want him present without asking him to explain himself. This accommodation feels both generous and isolating. The heir becomes aware that friendship has shifted from mutuality to protection. They are no longer sharing risk or ambition. They are preserving comfort for him and for themselves. His life has become something to handle gently. He resents this quietly, not because they are unkind, but because their kindness confirms what he would rather not accept, that he is no longer perceived as stable, that he is no longer assumed to be moving forward in the same direction as they are. When he speaks candidly, the room stills. Friends listen intently, nodding with sympathy, but they do not follow him into the details. They respond with encouragement rather than engagement. Their replies reassure rather than advance. The heir feels the difference keenly. Once, his ideas invited debate. Now they invite comfort. Comfort is not collaboration. He begins to moderate himself, sensing that honesty introduces discomfort. He simplifies his answers. He avoids specifics. He learns to speak in ways that reassure others that he is managing, adapting, fine. This performance, though gentler than before, is still a performance. Old friends, too, are managing something. They are reconciling memory with reality. They remember the heir as he was confident, expansive, assured. They struggle to align that memory with the man before them, careful, constrained, living at a smaller scale. Rather than force reconciliation, they preserve memory. They speak often of the past, shared experiences, former triumphs. These stories bind them together while avoiding the present. The heir participates willingly, grateful for the familiarity, even as he recognizes the subtle evasion at work. The past becomes neutral ground. In private moments, some friends attempt honesty. They offer advice cautiously, framed as concern. They suggest simplification, adaptation, resilience. Their words are careful not to sound instructive. They do not wish to presume authority. The heir listens politely, aware that their guidance arrives too late to be useful and too early to be dismissed. He appreciates the effort, yet he also feels the imbalance. Friendship, once effortless, now requires management. He must decide how much to reveal, how much to protect. He must interpret their tone, anticipate their discomfort, shield them from truths that might burden them unnecessarily. This labor is tiring. Gradually, meetings become less frequent, not from conflict, but from fatigue. The heir chooses solitude more often, not because he prefers it, but because it requires no translation. Alone, he does not need to reassure or perform. He can exist at his current scale without explanation. Old friends remain fond. They continue to speak well of him. They remember him kindly. They do not abandon him, but they no longer orbit him. Their lives move forward along paths that assume stability and growth. His life has turned inward, toward maintenance and acceptance. This divergence is quiet, irreversible. The heir comes to understand that friendship, like expectation, is a structure as real as walls. The heir discovers this gradually, as one discovers a draft in a room long occupied by noticing where warmth no longer gathers, where movement has slowed, where effort must now be deliberate. Reduced expectations do not announce themselves as loss. They arrive as accommodation, as the quiet recalibration of what seems reasonable. At first, this recalibration feels merciful. There is relief in not reaching for what can no longer be sustained. The heir finds comfort in narrowing his aims, in setting goals that can be met without strain. He stops imagining futures that require abundance. He begins to imagine futures that require only consistency. This feels like wisdom. But reduced expectations reshape more than plans. They reshape perception. The heir notices that his attention drifts toward what is manageable rather than what is meaningful. He chooses certainty over possibility, familiarity over ambition. These choices feel rational. They are also limiting. He adjusts without protest. The world encourages this adjustment. Advisors speak approvingly of restraint. Friends commend his adaptability. Even his own thoughts adopt a gentler tone, praising realism and balance. The heir accepts these affirmations gratefully, unaware of how thoroughly they lower the ceiling of his life. Days become predictable. Routines solidify. There are fewer surprises, fewer risks, fewer disappointments. The heir lives within parameters that no longer threaten collapse. This stability is earned, but it is also confining. The excitement that once animated decision-making has been replaced by calculation. Calculation becomes habit. He weighs every choice against consequence, every desire against feasibility. Pleasure is no longer spontaneous. It must justify itself. Indulgence feels irresponsible. The heir learns to enjoy moderation not because it satisfies him, but because it does not punish him. The house reflects this shift. Rooms are used consistently rather than impressively. Objects are maintained rather than replaced. Repairs are functional, never aspirational. The heir takes pride in this efficiency, seeing it as evidence of maturity. Yet something vital has been surrendered. Reduced expectations alter the emotional register of life. Joy becomes quieter, flatter. Hope becomes conditional. The heir no longer imagines transformation. He imagines endurance. This orientation keeps him safe, but it also keeps him contained. He notices this most in moments of pause. When nothing demands his attention, when routine loosens its grip, the heir feels a faint restlessness he cannot immediately name. It is not desire exactly, but memory of desire, the echo of wanting something beyond what is permitted by current conditions. He dismisses this feeling quickly. Indulging it would invite dissatisfaction. He tells himself that contentment lies in acceptance, that ambition is a relic of another life. These beliefs stabilize him, but they also anesthetize him. Reduced expectations become self-reinforcing. The heir stops proposing ideas that might fail. He stops seeking opportunities that require exposure. He becomes careful not just with money, but with hope. This caution protects him from disappointment, but it also deprives him of renewal. Others notice the change. They describe him as settled, grounded, practical. These words are meant kindly. They recognize adaptation rather than loss. The heir accepts them with a nod, aware that they describe a man who has learned how to remain intact, not how to expand. This is the final adjustment. Reduced expectations do not feel like surrender, because they are framed as responsibility. They are praised as wisdom, rewarded with stability, reinforced by routine. The heir does not feel defeated. He feels contained. Contained lives endure. They do not demand rescue. They do not provoke scandal. They persist quietly, efficiently, without disturbing the world around them. The heir understands this now. He has built a life that can be sustained without illusion. And yet, illusion once allowed for reach. The heir stands one evening at a window he no longer opens, watching the light fade across a view he no longer imagines owning beyond his lifetime. He feels neither despair nor longing, only a muted awareness that something has been resolved not through triumph, but through adjustment. Reduced expectations have made survival possible. They have also made transcendence unlikely. This realization does not wound him sharply. It settles instead, like a weight evenly distributed. He continues living, carefully, responsibly, within the limits he has learned to respect. But somewhere beneath that respect lies the knowledge that expectations, once lowered, rarely rise again, and that a life lived entirely within them may remain intact, yet never fully awake to what it might have been. The heir accepts this quietly. There is no rebellion left in him, only understanding. Reduced expectations have given him peace, of a sort stable, manageable, sufficient. And sufficiency, he now knows, is not failure. It is simply what remains when the future has been taught not to ask for more. The questions end before the answers do. At first, the heir does not notice. He has grown accustomed to fewer inquiries, fewer consultations, fewer moments where his opinion is sought instinctively. This change feels natural, almost welcome. Fewer questions mean fewer expectations. Fewer expectations mean fewer opportunities to disappoint. The silence feels earned. Where once he was asked to weigh in on ventures, introductions, decisions of consequence, now he is informed rather than consulted. Information arrives complete, requiring no response. Plans are shared after they are settled. The heir recognizes this shift dimly, but does not resist it. Resistance would require relevance. The world, efficient and polite, has adjusted its assumptions. It no longer assumes that the heir will provide leverage, access, or momentum. He is no longer perceived as an accelerant. His presence does not change outcomes, and so, without malice or announcement, he is removed from the process. This removal is gentle. There is no exclusion, no slight. Invitations still arrive. Greetings remain warm. The heir is included socially, ceremonially, nostalgically. What has changed is function. He is no longer necessary to the unfolding of events. The heir becomes an observer. He listens as others discuss matters that once would have involved him directly. He nods at conclusions reached without his input. He offers occasional comments, carefully phrased, which are acknowledged politely and then absorbed or ignored without consequence. This is not disrespect. It is efficiency. The heir senses this truth slowly, through repetition rather than revelation. Each instance alone feels incidental. Together, they form a pattern impossible to dismiss. The world has stopped asking because it no longer expects an answer that will alter its course. This realization is sobering. To be asked is to be trusted. To be consulted is to be considered capable of shaping outcomes. The heir understands now that these privileges were never permanent. They were contingent on resources, on momentum, on the ability to absorb risk. Once that ability faded, so did the questions. The heir experiences a brief impulse to assert himself. He considers offering opinions more forcefully, volunteering insight, re-entering conversations with confidence. But the effort feels artificial, out of step with the current order. He senses that forcing relevance would only highlight its absence. And so he refrains. Refraining becomes habit. The heir adapts to his new position quietly. He listens more than he speaks. He observes dynamics he once influenced. He becomes attentive to nuance rather than outcome. This attentiveness brings a strange clarity. Without the pressure to decide, he sees more accurately. He sees how decisions are made now, pragmatically, cautiously, without reference to legacy or expectation. The world has moved into a mode that prioritizes function over continuity. The heir recognizes this, not with bitterness, but with a kind of respect. The system is behaving as it always does, adjusting to available resources. He was once a resource. Now he is a presence. Presence, while valuable socially, does not shape trajectories. The heir accepts this distinction slowly, learning to inhabit conversations without trying to steer them. He finds relief in this, even as he mourns the loss it represents. There is a subtle dignity in stepping aside. The heir discovers that not being asked frees him from responsibility for outcomes he can no longer influence. He is spared the burden of expectation. He is allowed to exist without proving utility. This freedom, though born of decline, is real, yet it carries a cost. The heir feels himself becoming peripheral to the future. He watches others plan, build, expand. Their ambitions do not include him, not from exclusion, but from irrelevance. He is associated with a chapter already written, a world already concluded. This association settles around him quietly. He stops offering suggestions unless asked. He stops anticipating requests that never arrive. He learns to measure his worth not by impact, but by presence. This adjustment is profound. It alters how he understands himself. Identity shifts. The heir no longer defines himself by influence or inheritance. He defines himself by endurance, by adaptation, by the quiet maintenance of a life reduced but intact. He learns to value stability over consequence, observation over authority. The questions do not return. They are asked elsewhere now, of those positioned to answer them effectively. The heir does not resent this. He understands it. The world asks questions where answers can still change things. He no longer can. And so he lives within this new silence, attentive, measured, no longer summoned. The absence of questions marks the final stage of his transition, not into obscurity, but into neutrality. He has not failed publicly. He has not fallen spectacularly. He has simply ceased to matter in the ways that once defined him. This realization does not break him. It steadies him. For in no longer being asked, the heir is finally released from the illusion that he must still perform a role the world has already reassigned. He exists now without expectation, without pretense, without the pressure of relevance. And in that quiet, he learns something late, but clearly. That being asked was never a right, it was a condition. And conditions, once altered, do not return simply because one remembers how they used to be. The relief arrives unexpectedly. It does not announce itself as peace, nor does it resemble happiness in any familiar form. It is quieter than either a loosening, a release from tension so constant it had ceased to be noticed. The heir experiences it first as absence, the absence of vigilance, of calculation, of the steady internal rehearsal that once accompanied every interaction. There is nothing left to maintain. This realization does not feel like defeat. It feels like permission. The heir wakes one morning and understands, with a clarity both unsettling and gentle, that there is no longer any audience to convince, no illusion to sustain. The world has already adjusted its expectations. He is no longer required to correct them. The effort falls away. Clothing is chosen for comfort rather than implication. Speech becomes direct, stripped of the careful phrasing once used to soften reality. The heir stops translating his life into acceptable language. He speaks plainly when he speaks at all. This plainness is not crude. It is precise. Without the need to perform continuity, the heir discovers an unfamiliar honesty in himself. He admits limits without embarrassment. He declines invitations without explanation. He allows conversations to end naturally rather than steering them toward reassurance. Others respond with ease. They sense the change immediately. Interactions become simpler, lighter. Without pretense, there is less tension to navigate. The heir notices that people relax around him now, no longer uncertain how to treat him. He is not an emblem to be preserved. He is simply present. This simplicity is comforting. For years, pretending had served as armor. It protected the heir from scrutiny, but it also isolated him from reality. Every gesture had been measured, every word had been weighted. Even solitude had been performative, rehearsed as preparation for the next appearance. Now solitude is just solitude. The heir spends time alone without justification. He reads without agenda. He walks without destination. These activities, once rare, now form the structure of his days. He does not frame them as retreat. He experiences them as inhabitation. The house feels different. Not smaller, but quieter in a way that no longer demands explanation. Rooms exist to be used, not displayed. Objects remain where they are placed, not where they suggest something. The heir senses a harmony between space and purpose that had been absent for years. This harmony is modest. It does not impress. It does not aspire. It simply functions. The heir finds himself caring for the house not as a symbol, but as a shelter. Maintenance becomes practical rather than aesthetic. This shift feels grounding. Memory loses its grip. Without pretending to recover what was lost, the heir stops measuring the present against the past. The comparisons fade. What remains is a life evaluated on its own terms, narrower, quieter, but coherent. Coherence is the unexpected gift. For the first time in years, the heir's actions align with his circumstances. There is no discrepancy to manage, no gap to disguise. The strain that once expressed itself through nerves and vigilance dissolves into something steadier. He sleeps better, not because his life has improved materially, but because it has stopped contradicting itself. The mind, no longer required to maintain illusion, rests more easily. The heir wakes without the dull anxiety that once accompanied every morning. There are moments of sadness. They arrive unpredictably, triggered by memory or habit. The heir allows them without resistance. He does not frame them as regret, nor does he attempt to resolve them. They pass as naturally as they arrive. This acceptance feels mature, not triumphant, but earned. The heir understands now that pretending delayed adjustment, but it also protected him while he learned how to live without what once defined him. The performance was not useless, it was transitional, and now the transition is complete. The comfort of no longer pretending lies not in satisfaction, but in relief. The heir is no longer divided between appearance and reality. He is no longer negotiating with the world to be seen as something he is not. He exists plainly. This plainness does not erase loss, but it softens its edges. It allows the heir to engage with the present without rehearsal. It permits him to be known accurately, if at all. For the first time, the heir feels proportionate to his life. He no longer needs to be larger than his circumstances. He no longer needs to justify reduction or explain restraint. The world does not ask. He does not offer. There is dignity in this quiet. It is not the dignity of success or recovery. It is the dignity of alignment, the calm that comes when a life stops performing and begins simply to be lived. And in that calm, the heir discovers something he had not expected to find at the end of decline. Not redemption, not restoration, but the rare, understated comfort of no longer pretending to be anything other than what remains. History has a way of changing its tone. What was once recounted with admiration is retold, later, with emphasis, details sharpened, omissions filled, conclusions drawn that no one dared articulate at the time. The heir senses this shift, not in direct commentary, but in the cadence of conversation, in the way his name is paired with a lesson rather than a lineage. He has entered the past. Not the distant past of archives and portraits, but the nearer past, the kind still spoken of by those who remember, yet already arranged into meaning. His life, once unfolding, is now being interpreted. This does not feel hostile. It feels orderly. People speak of him in summaries now. They condense years into phrases. Misjudged timing, unfortunate circumstances, too much faith in continuity. These assessments are delivered gently, often with sympathy. They are meant to explain, not condemn. Explanation, however, is a kind of closure. The heir recognizes that he is no longer being considered as a participant in the present, but as a reference point. His story is invoked when advising others, when illustrating risk, when cautioning against assumption. He is no longer the subject of conversation, but its example. This is unsettling at first. To hear one's life reduced to pattern, to be spoken of without room for revision, feels like a second loss. The heir listens quietly when such conversations occur nearby. He does not interrupt. Correction would be pointless. History does not accept amendments from those it has already absorbed. The details are simplified. Nuance gives way to clarity. Complexity yields to moral. The long years of adjustment, the quiet calculations, the restrained decisions, these fade from the retelling. What remains is the arc. Rise, delay, decline. It is clean, it is instructive, and it is incomplete. The heir understands this intimately, yet he does not resent it. History is not designed to preserve interior truth. It preserves outcomes. It extracts lessons, not experiences. The heir accepts this with a steadiness earned through long accommodation. He notices how others respond. Younger men listen attentively when his story is mentioned, absorbing its warning without imagining themselves within it. They nod, confident that awareness will protect them. Older ones recall parallels, speaking more softly, recognizing familiar missteps. The heir is rarely addressed directly in these moments. He is present, but not invited to comment. His silence is interpreted as dignity. He allows this interpretation to stand. It is easier than explaining how much of the story resists simplification. Cautionary tales are efficient. They convert lives into instruction, smoothing rough edges, clarifying cause and effect. They reassure listeners that decline follows predictable rules, that foresight prevents collapse, that prudence guarantees endurance. The heir knows better. He knows how easily foresight can be postponed, how prudence can be overwhelmed by inherited assumptions, how endurance can erode quietly while appearances hold. He knows that his story cannot be prevented by awareness alone. Yet he does not say this aloud. To complicate the lesson would be to disrupt its usefulness. History prefers clean warnings. The heir allows himself to be useful in this limited way, even as he recognizes the cost. There is a strange peace in being concluded. No more anticipation. No more expectation of reversal. The future no longer demands explanation. The heir is free from the burden of potential. What remains is reflection, quiet, private, unshared. He reflects not on where he went wrong, but on how gradually the shift occurred. He understands now that decline rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as continuity, sustained by habit and reinforced by silence. The cautionary tale rarely includes this truth. It prefers decisive moments, identifiable errors. Reality is slower. The heir walks through spaces that once symbolized permanence, now content in their modest use. He listens to the way others speak of him and recognizes the distance between their version and his lived experience. This distance no longer troubles him. He has stopped needing to be understood. History will do what it does. It will select, condense, instruct. It will turn a life into a marker on a path others hope not to follow. The heir accepts this role without bitterness. He has learned that being remembered accurately is rare. Being remembered usefully is more common. And usefulness, even in reduction, has its own quiet dignity. The heir has ceased to argue with the narrative forming around him. He allows it to settle, to circulate, to serve its purpose. When he is spoken of now, it is with a careful tone, a mixture of respect and restraint. The story carries weight not because of scandal, but because of recognition. Others see in it a version of themselves they would rather not become. The heir hears this and understands. He has become what the future uses to warn itself. And in that transformation from actor to example, from presence to precedent, his life completes its final transition. Not into obscurity, but into history of a particular kind. Not celebrated, not erased, but instructive. A cautionary tale does not ask to be admired. It asks to be remembered. And the heir, standing quietly at the edge of conversations that no longer include him, understands that this, too, is a form of survival, one measured not by restoration or applause, but by the simple, enduring fact of having been learned from. The body slows before the world does. The heir notices this first in the mornings, when rising requires intention rather than habit, when the day no longer unfolds automatically but must be coaxed into motion. There is no sudden illness, no dramatic collapse, only a steady narrowing, a gentle insistence that energy is no longer abundant. This feels familiar. It mirrors the pattern of the fortune itself, not lost at once, but thinned over time, reduced through quiet exchanges and deferred reckonings. The heir recognizes the symmetry without comment. His life has always moved this way, gradually, politely, without spectacle. Doctors speak carefully now. They frame their assessments in terms of management rather than cure, comfort rather than recovery. Their language is precise, unalarming, merciful. The heir listens attentively, not because he hopes for reversal, but because he appreciates accuracy. He has grown accustomed to truths delivered without promise. The future contracts. Plans become short-term by necessity. The heir does not resist this. Long horizons no longer interest him. He prefers the immediacy of routine, the known sequence of hours, the predictability of days. There is comfort in living close to the present when the future offers nothing but repetition. Visitors arrive less often, not from neglect, but from completion. Conversations feel resolved. Old acquaintances sense that there is nothing left to discuss that has not already been understood. The heir receives them graciously when they do come, but does not miss them when they do not. Solitude has become natural. In quiet moments, the heir reflects not on what he failed to achieve, but on what he was promised without asking. Inheritance had implied continuity, endurance, insulation from ordinary limits. These implications shaped his early decisions more powerfully than any explicit instruction. The promise was never spoken. It was assumed. To die with less than was promised feels, at first, like injustice. The heir entertains this thought briefly, examining it with the same calm scrutiny he has learned to apply to all conclusions. The thought does not hold. No promise was broken. What he received was exactly what inheritance offers: opportunity without instruction, resources without immunity, continuity without guarantee. The promise existed only because it was convenient to believe in it. This realization brings no anger, only clarity. The heir understands now that his life was not stolen from him. It was spent slowly, deliberately, often in service of appearances rather than substance. This understanding does not accuse, it simply accounts. The house accommodates him gently. Rooms once meant for gathering now serve rest. Objects once displayed now serve memory. The scale of the space no longer impresses or burdens him. It simply exists, quietly supporting the life that remains. He thinks of the children, not with regret, but with curiosity. They have grown into a world that no longer assumes permanence. They will not inherit illusion, as he did. Whatever they possess will arrive without ceremony, without promise. This feels, unexpectedly, like mercy. To die with less than was promised is not to die cheated. It is to die corrected. The heir senses this correction settling into place, aligning his expectations with his reality at last. The tension that once defined his life has dissolved. There is no discrepancy left to manage. What remains is proportion. He takes satisfaction in small things: the weight of a book, the light in a window, the order of familiar objects. These satisfactions are not substitutes, they are sufficient. When thoughts of the past arise, they do so without bitterness. The heir sees his life now as a sequence of reasonable decisions made under flawed assumptions. He forgives himself those assumptions easily. They were common. They were taught without words. As the days shorten, he becomes attentive to stillness. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion, the quiet that follows effort finally laid down. He does not fear it. He recognizes it as the natural end of a life that has resolved itself. There are no final declarations, no reconciliations demanded, no truths left unsaid that require saying. The heir has already surrendered the need to be understood. He does not seek absolution or acknowledgement. He simply remains. Dying with less than was promised does not feel like failure. It feels like arrival at the truth of things, late, perhaps, but intact. The heir understands now that the promise was never about quantity, but about continuity. And continuity, he has learned, does not belong to individuals. It belongs to time. As his own time narrows, he accepts this without resistance. He has lived long enough to see the promise dissolve, and in its place, something quieter and more durable emerge. Not wealth, not legacy, but the calm knowledge of what remains when expectation has finally been released. There are things that remain when accounts close. They do not appear on ledgers, cannot be transferred by deed, cannot be liquidated to soften a final reckoning. The heir becomes aware of these things only after everything else has been reduced to clarity, when money has lost its authority, when reputation has settled into memory, when time has narrowed to a manageable horizon. What remains does not announce itself as inheritance. It does not arrive with ceremony or expectation. It is simply there, accumulated quietly across decades of error, adaptation, endurance. The heir recognizes it not as possession, but as residue, the substance left behind when illusion has been stripped away. There is judgment here, but not condemnation. The heir understands now how to read consequence without panic. He understands how quickly comfort can deceive, how politely decline can proceed, how easily continuity can be mistaken for permanence. These understandings are not dramatic, they are precise. Precision is their value. He notices this inheritance in small moments, when he hears confidence spoken too easily and recognizes its fragility, when he watches others assume that conditions will hold because they always have, when he senses the early signs of narrowing that once escaped him entirely. He does not intervene. Experience has taught him that warnings are rarely heard when comfort remains intact. The inheritance he carries cannot be handed over directly. It resists instruction. It must be learned through erosion, through recalibration, through the slow education of loss. This inheritance cannot be spent. It does not diminish with use. It does not inflate with attention. It remains constant, available only to the one who carries it. The heir understands this with a clarity that would have seemed useless earlier, but now feels exact. He has learned how to live without leverage. This is no small thing. To exist without expecting systems to bend, without assuming that names or histories will intervene, is to move through the world differently. The heir has learned to listen more carefully, to decide more modestly, to accept boundaries without resentment. These are not virtues he sought. They arrived by necessity. He has learned the cost of delay, not in theory, but in sequence, in watching each postponement make the next unavoidable. He understands now how timing shapes outcome more decisively than intention. This knowledge cannot be taught. It must be endured. He has learned the comfort of alignment, of living within what is rather than negotiating with what was, of allowing scale to match capacity, of choosing coherence over display. This comfort, once unimaginable, now feels indispensable. None of this can be passed down intact. Children may inherit property, habits, even caution, but the precise understanding forged through loss does not survive translation. It remains bound to the life that learned it. The heir accepts this without bitterness. He no longer measures worth by what will continue after him. He understands that legacy is not always something others receive. Sometimes it is simply the shape a life takes once it has been corrected. In this sense, the inheritance that cannot be spent is complete. It does not grow. It does not require preservation. It does not demand recognition. It exists quietly, fully formed, immune to erosion because it was created by it. As the heir's days shorten, he finds himself less interested in resolution than in accuracy. He prefers truths that do not promise improvement. He values clarity over comfort. These preferences, once foreign, now feel natural. He leaves no instructions, not because he has nothing to say, but because what he knows cannot be implemented by others without context. He understands now that the most enduring lessons are not delivered, they are discovered. The inheritance he carries will end with him. And this does not trouble him. He has stopped believing that continuation is the measure of success. Some things exist only to complete the life that contains them. Their value lies in their finality. When the heir reflects on his life now, he does not catalogue losses or failures. He sees instead a gradual movement toward proportion, a long correction that arrived slowly enough to be endured. This correction has produced something durable, not wealth, not influence, not continuity, but an understanding that does not depend on circumstance to remain true. The inheritance that cannot be spent has already served its purpose. It has shaped the last version of the heir into something smaller, quieter, and finally exact. And that, he understands now, is enough. What remains is not absence. It is shape. The heir senses this in the final quiet of his days, when the world has stopped asking anything of him and he has stopped asking anything of it. The rooms he inhabits are familiar now, not as symbols, but as companions, walls that have learned his pace, windows that admit light without promise, objects that no longer imply continuity, only presence. The fortune is gone to history. Not erased, not denied, simply concluded. It exists now in ledgers closed long ago, in anecdotes softened by time, in lessons others repeat without knowing how fully they were lived. It no longer presses upon the present. It has released its hold. What remains is proportion. The heir's life, once stretched beyond its limits by expectation, has resolved into a scale that fits. Each day contains what it can hold, no more, no less. There is no urgency left to manage, no performance to sustain. Time moves evenly, without negotiation. This evenness is unfamiliar, and therefore instructive. The heir notices how little is required to maintain it. A modest routine, a small set of needs, an acceptance of limits that no longer feel like constraints, but like boundaries clearly marked. The anxiety that once haunted every calculation has vanished, replaced by attentiveness. He attends to what is near. A cup warmed by the hand, a page turned slowly, a sound carried from another room. These details do not distract from some larger purpose. They are the purpose now. The heir does not romanticize them. He simply allows them to matter. Memory has settled. It no longer intrudes sharply. It no longer demands comparison. The past exists as context rather than standard. The heir recalls it without longing, without defense. It is complete, as he is nearly complete. He understands now that the fortune's true power was never in what it provided, but in what it postponed. It delayed consequence. It deferred proportion. It allowed the future to remain abstract. When that power dissolved, life was forced into clarity. The heir resisted this at first, as most do. But clarity, once accepted, proved less cruel than imagined. What remains after the fortune is gone is not ruin. It is accuracy. The heir sees his life clearly now, without embellishment or apology. He does not divide it into success and failure. He understands it as sequence of assumptions made, of delays chosen, of adjustments learned too late to preserve abundance, but early enough to preserve coherence. Coherence has become his final possession. There is no audience left to receive it, no ledger to record it, no inheritance to transmit it. It belongs entirely to the life that formed it. This exclusivity does not trouble him. Not everything must continue. The heir has come to accept that some things exist only to be resolved. His life, once charged with promise and protected by illusion, has resolved itself fully, not into triumph, but into truth. He is not proud of this truth. He is not ashamed of it either. It simply is. In the final reckoning, the heir understands that fortune was never the center of his life. It was the condition that shaped its early movement. When that condition ended, the life did not disappear. It recalibrated. This recalibration is the story's end. There are no final gestures, no attempts at summary, no desire to be remembered correctly. The heir no longer measures meaning by recognition. He measures it by completion. As his days conclude, they do so quietly. There is no spectacle, no reckoning demanded by others. The world continues without reference to him, as it always does. This continuity, once assumed as inheritance, is now understood as independence. The heir does not resent it. He rests within the knowledge that what mattered has already happened, that the long arc of adjustment, though costly, brought him to a place where nothing remains unresolved. What remains after the fortune is gone is not a lesson for others. It is a life finally aligned with itself. And alignment, he has learned at the end, is the rarest inheritance of all, one that cannot be spent, cannot be transferred, and does not survive its owner. It exists only once, and once is enough.